In 1938, a letter arrived in a small Swedish village, carrying news that would reshape humanity's understanding of the atom, and Lise Meitner read it while standing in the snow, her mind already racing toward a truth the world was not yet ready to hold. Hers is a story that unfolds across decades of quiet persistence, through the lamplit laboratories of Berlin, through exile and erasure and the strange, bittersweet weight of discovery claimed by others. If these gentle explorations help carry you toward rest, you might consider subscribing, so that more such evenings can find their way to you. For now, there is only this, the soft cadence of a life devoted to understanding, the patience of a scientist who believed that nature reveals itself slowly, to those willing to wait. And so we begin with Vienna, in the final years of the old century, where a young girl first learned to wonder. On the 7th day of November, in the year 1878, in the imperial city of Vienna, a child was born who would one day help unlock the deepest secrets of the atom, though of course no one could have known this at the time, and the baby herself was concerned, as all newborns are, only with the warmth of her mother's arms and the soft sounds of a household already busy with the comings and goings of older siblings. She was given the name Elise, a gentle name with its soft syllables, though in time she would come to shorten it to Lise, and it is as Lise Meitner that history would remember her, though on that November evening she was simply another daughter welcomed into a family that would grow to include 8 children in all, each finding their place in the crowded, book-filled rooms of a home in Vienna's second district. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in those days stretched across a vast patchwork of lands and peoples, from the snowy peaks of the Alps to the broad plains of Hungary, and Vienna sat at its heart like a jewel in an ancient crown, a city of coffeehouses and concert halls, of grand boulevards and quiet courtyards where laundry hung from lines strung between windows and children played in the fading afternoon light. The empire was ruled by Franz Joseph I, who had already sat upon his throne for 30 years by the time Elise drew her first breath, and who would continue to reign for nearly 4 more decades, his long white whiskers and military bearing becoming as familiar to his subjects as the faces of their own grandfathers. It was a world that seemed permanent and solid, built of heavy stone and old traditions, though change was stirring beneath the surface in ways both political and scientific, and the century that was drawing toward its close would give way to one of transformation beyond anyone's imagining. The family into which Elise was born occupied a comfortable position in Viennese society, though their comfort had been hard-won and was still, in some ways, precarious. Her father, Philip Meitner, was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer but one of the first Jewish men to be admitted to the bar in Vienna, a distinction that spoke both to his considerable abilities and to the slowly changing attitudes of the empire toward its Jewish citizens. For generations, Jewish people in Austria had faced restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter, and how they could participate in public life, and though these barriers were beginning to fall in the liberal atmosphere of the 1860s and 70s, they had not disappeared entirely, and a man like Philip Meitner had to be exceptional merely to be allowed to practice his profession. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful and principled man, devoted to his family and to the life of the mind, and he brought to his household a spirit of inquiry and openness that would shape his children in profound ways. Elise's mother, Hedwig Skovron Meitner, managed the household with quiet competence, as mothers of large families must, ensuring that there was food on the table and clothes on backs and that the endless small crises of childhood were met with patience and practical wisdom. The family lived in Leopoldstadt, the second district of Vienna, which lay across the Danube Canal from the more fashionable inner city and had long been home to a thriving Jewish community. It was a neighborhood of synagogues and kosher butchers, of scholars and merchants and tradespeople, but also of families like the Meitners who had moved some distance from traditional religious observance and embraced the secular, assimilated life of liberal Viennese Jewry. They considered themselves Austrians first, citizens of a modern empire that was slowly, fitfully, learning to accept them as equals, and they participated fully in the cultural and intellectual life of their city while maintaining a quiet awareness of their heritage and the history that had brought them to this place. There is a small curiosity in the official records, the sort of detail that might easily be overlooked but which tells us something about the delicate position of assimilated Jewish families in this era. The date of Elise's birth was registered not as November 7th but as November 17th, 10 days later than the actual event, and this adjustment was made to avoid a conflict with a Jewish holiday that fell around the time of her birth. Such small accommodations were common among families navigating between their Jewish identity and their desire to participate fully in the broader society, and while the Meitners did not strictly observe religious traditions, they were not yet ready to disregard them entirely, and so the official paperwork was quietly arranged to smooth over any potential awkwardness. It is a reminder that even in the most liberal corners of the empire, Jewish families lived with an awareness of their difference, making countless small calculations about how to present themselves to the wider world. The Meitner household was, above all, a place where ideas were taken seriously and where children were encouraged to think and question and learn. Philipp Meitner held progressive views on many subjects, including the education of women, which was by no means a common position in his day. He believed that his daughters deserved the same intellectual opportunities as his sons, and he supported their curiosity and their studies at a time when most fathers saw little point in educating girls beyond the basics of reading, writing, and household management. In the evenings, after the day's work was done and the younger children had been put to bed, the family would gather for discussions of science and culture, of politics and philosophy, and Elise absorbed these conversations like a sponge, her quick mind finding nourishment in the exchange of ideas. Books lined the walls of their home, and reading was encouraged not as a duty but as a pleasure, a window onto worlds beyond the crowded streets of Leopoldstadt. Among the 8 Meitner children, Elise found particular companionship with her sisters Gisela and Frieda, who were close to her in age and temperament. The 3 girls shared the experience of growing up female in a world that offered limited horizons to women, no matter how bright or ambitious they might be, and they supported one another through the frustrations and small triumphs of their education. Gisela would go on to study music, and Frieda would become a writer, and together with Lise they formed a sisterhood of intellect and aspiration that sustained them throughout their lives. The brothers, too, played their part in the busy household, and mealtimes must have been lively affairs, with so many voices competing to be heard and so many opinions to be aired, though one imagines that Philipp Meitner presided over it all with a lawyer's love of reasoned argument and a father's patient tolerance for the enthusiasms of the young. From an early age, Elise showed a particular fascination with the workings of the natural world, with the patterns and principles that lay beneath the surface of everyday experience. She would later recall a childhood memory that stayed with her throughout her life, the simple sight of an oil slick on a puddle of water, the thin film spreading across the surface and breaking the light into bands of shimmering color. It was a phenomenon that any child might notice and then forget, but Elise did not forget, she wondered, and in her wondering lay the seeds of a scientific mind. The colors in the oil were caused by a process called interference, in which light waves reflecting from the top and bottom surfaces of the thin film combine and cancel in ways that depend on their wavelength, producing the rainbow effect that had caught her eye. She did not know this at the time, of course, she knew only that it was beautiful and strange and that she wanted to understand it, and that desire to understand would become the driving force of her life. There is a detail about the young Elise that captures something essential about her character, the fact that she kept a journal of physics questions tucked beneath her pillow at night. While other children might have hidden sweets or treasured toys in their beds, she kept a notebook filled with the questions that occurred to her as she lay in the dark, questions about light and matter and the mysterious forces that governed the universe. It was as though she could not bear to let a thought escape unrecorded, as though the questions themselves were precious things that deserved to be preserved and pondered. This habit speaks to a mind that was never truly at rest, always turning over problems and possibilities, and yet there is something gentle and almost comforting about it too, the image of a young girl falling asleep with her questions close at hand, like companions keeping watch through the night. The educational opportunities available to girls in Austria at this time were severely limited, a fact that would shape the course of Elise's early life and require considerable determination to overcome. Public schooling for girls ended at the age of 14, a policy that reflected the widespread belief that women's proper sphere was the home and that advanced education was unnecessary and perhaps even undesirable for the female sex. A girl might learn to read and write and do simple arithmetic, she might study a little history and geography and domestic science, but the doors to higher learning, to the gymnasiums and universities where serious scholarship took place, were firmly closed to her. This was the world into which Elise was born, a world that would ask her to set aside her questions and her journal and content herself with the life that society had prescribed for young women of her class and time. But Elise did not set aside her questions, and her father did not ask her to. Philipp Meitner recognized something in his daughter, a quality of mind that deserved cultivation, and he was willing to invest in her education even when the formal institutions of his country would not. After she completed the limited public schooling available to her, arrangements were made for private tutoring to continue her studies, a privilege that was available only to families with the means and the will to provide it. She worked with tutors who introduced her to mathematics and physics and the classical languages, filling in the gaps left by an educational system designed to keep women in their place, and she proved herself more than equal to the challenge, mastering material that was supposedly beyond the capacity of the female mind. The family's religious identity continued to evolve during these years, as it did for many assimilated Jewish families in Vienna who felt the pull of the broader culture and the desire to remove any remaining barriers to full participation in society. In 1908, when Elise was nearly 30 years old and already embarked on her scientific career, she was baptized into the Protestant faith, a step that her parents and several of her siblings also took at various times. This conversion was not unusual among educated, assimilated Jews in German-speaking lands, who saw Protestantism as a form of Christianity more compatible with their liberal, rationalist outlook, and who hoped that baptism might ease their path in a world that still, despite all the progress of the liberal era, harbored deep currents of antisemitism. Whether Lise's conversion reflected genuine religious conviction or was primarily a practical accommodation to the society in which she lived is difficult to say at this distance, and perhaps the answer contains elements of both, as such decisions often do. The Vienna of Lise Meitner's childhood was a city on the cusp of the modern age, a place where the old certainties of empire and tradition existed alongside new ideas about science and society and the proper ordering of human life. Horse-drawn carriages still clattered over cobblestone streets, but the first electric trams were beginning to appear, and the great discoveries that would transform the 20th century, the discovery of radioactivity, the unraveling of atomic structure, the strange new physics of quanta and relativity, were waiting just over the horizon. In the comfortable rooms of the Meitner household, a young girl with a notebook under her pillow was preparing herself, without knowing it, to take part in those discoveries, to stand at the frontier of human knowledge and peer into the heart of matter itself. But all of that lay in the future, and for now there was only the warmth of family, the pleasure of a new book, the endlessly fascinating colors in a film of oil on water, and the slow, gentle passage of a Viennese childhood in the age of empire. In the year 1892, a young girl named Lise Meitner reached the age of 14, and with that unremarkable milestone came an ending that must have felt both ordinary and quietly devastating, for in Austria at that time, the formal education of girls simply stopped at this age, like a path that ends abruptly at the edge of a meadow, offering no clear way forward through the trees beyond. She had completed her studies at the Bürgerschule, the civic school for middle-class girls, and she had done so with evident capability and a particular fondness for mathematics and the natural sciences, subjects that seemed to speak to some deep ordering principle within her mind, yet none of this mattered in any practical sense, because the doors to further education stood firmly closed to young women, barred not by locks of iron but by the equally immovable barriers of custom and regulation. And so Lise Meitner found herself in a kind of educational limbo, suspended between the childhood learning that had ended too soon and the scholarly life that seemed impossibly distant, if it existed for her at all. The years that followed were quiet ones in some respects, though they were not idle years, and we might imagine her moving through them with a patience that was perhaps as much necessity as temperament, for there was simply nothing to be done about the situation except to wait and to prepare in whatever small ways presented themselves. Her family was supportive of her intellectual interests, her father in particular understanding that his daughter possessed a mind of unusual quality, and this domestic encouragement must have provided some comfort during what might otherwise have been years of pure frustration, though comfort alone does not open university doors or grant examination privileges. The household continued its rhythms, and Lise Meitner continued to read and to think about the questions that interested her, the behavior of light and heat and the mathematical relationships that seemed to underlie the physical world, subjects that she pursued with quiet determination even as they remained formally inaccessible to her. During this period of waiting, practical considerations also made themselves felt, for even in a comfortable middle-class family, a young woman was expected to prepare for some form of respectable livelihood, and the teaching profession offered one of the few acceptable paths forward for an educated woman of her social standing. And so Lise Meitner undertook to obtain a French teaching certificate, studying the language with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, preparing herself for a career that she could pursue respectably while perhaps continuing her private interests in science on the side, as a kind of intellectual hobby rather than a vocation. We might imagine her conjugating French verbs and practicing her pronunciation, all the while thinking of other things entirely, of the physics problems that truly captured her imagination, though she was too practical and too realistic to suppose that these deeper interests could ever become the center of her professional life. The French teaching certificate was a sensible choice, a reasonable fallback position, the kind of preparation that any prudent young woman in her situation might make, and there is something both admirable and poignant in this pragmatism, this willingness to accept what seemed to be the shape of her future while quietly hoping for something more. Then, in 1897, came news that must have reached the Meitner household like a small but significant shift in the weather, barely perceptible at first but carrying the promise of real change. The Austrian government had passed a reform allowing women, for the first time, to sit for the Matura examination, that crucial gateway to university education that had previously been reserved exclusively for young men. The Matura was the culminating examination of the gymnasium, the classical secondary school that prepared students for higher learning, and without passing it, university enrollment was simply impossible, so this reform, modest as it might seem from our present vantage point, represented a genuine opening, a crack in the wall that had seemed so solid and permanent. Lise Meitner was 19 years old when this change came into effect, no longer a child but still young enough to contemplate beginning again, to imagine compressing years of missed education into whatever time might be required, and the decision to attempt this must have formed quickly in her mind, or perhaps it had been forming all along, waiting only for the opportunity to become real. The challenge before her was considerable, and we should take a moment to appreciate its true dimensions. For the gymnasium curriculum that young men completed over 8 years of study, Lise Meitner would need to master in a far shorter time, catching up on all those subjects that had been moving steadily forward while she had been standing still. She engaged a private tutor named Arthur Sarvasi, a young physicist who would later have his own modest career in science, and under his instruction she began the work of compression, of folding 8 years of learning into 2, covering the classical languages and the mathematics and the sciences that the gymnasium demanded, working with an intensity that must have been exhausting even as it was exhilarating. We might picture her at her studies, perhaps at a desk by a window, the light changing through the seasons as Latin declensions and Greek paradigms gave way to algebraic equations and the principles of physics, each subject claiming its portion of her days while the goal of the Matura drew slowly closer, still distant but no longer impossibly so. The work with Sarvasi proceeded systematically, as such work must, building the foundation of classical education that university admission required, and Lise Meitner proved to be exactly the kind of student who could manage such an accelerated program, possessed of both the intellectual capacity to absorb complex material quickly and the disciplined temperament to maintain her efforts over the long months of preparation. 2 years is not a long time when measured against a lifetime, but 2 years of intensive study, of daily lessons and evening reviews, of examinations in one subject followed immediately by the commencement of another, 2 years spent catching up to young men who had enjoyed the leisure of 8. This represented a sustained effort of considerable magnitude, and she met it with quiet determination, advancing steadily toward the examination that would determine whether the doors of the university would open for her at last. In 1901, Lise Meitner presented herself for the Matura examination at the Akademisches Gymnasium in Vienna, sitting for the same tests that the male students of that institution completed as the natural culmination of their years of study, though for her it represented something rather different, the validation of her unconventional path and the proof that she could meet the standards that had been established without any thought of accommodating her. She was one of 4 women in that examination group, a small cohort of pioneers passing through a doorway that had only just been opened, and the examinations covered the full range of gymnasium subjects, testing her preparation in languages and literature, in history and philosophy, in mathematics and the natural sciences, each paper representing a hurdle that had to be cleared before the next could be attempted. When the results were announced, Lise Meitner had passed, had demonstrated her readiness for university study as convincingly as any young man who had enjoyed the full 8 years of formal preparation, and the path that had seemed so impossible just a few years before now lay open before her, leading toward the University of Vienna and the life of scientific inquiry she had imagined for so long. In the autumn of 1901, Lise Meitner enrolled at the University of Vienna, becoming one of the first women to be admitted to that ancient institution, which had educated generations of scholars and scientists over its 5 centuries of existence, but had never before opened its lecture halls to female students on equal terms. She was 23 years old, older than most of her fellow students but perhaps more determined as well, and she chose to study physics, the subject that had captured her imagination most completely during her years of preparation, the discipline that seemed to offer the most profound insights into the fundamental workings of the natural world. Among her fellow students was another young woman named Olga Steindler, and we might imagine these two pioneers finding some comfort in each other's presence, some reassurance in knowing that they were not entirely alone in this unfamiliar environment, though they were few enough that the experience of being a woman in the physics lecture hall must still have felt isolating at times. Her coursework brought her into contact with some of the finest scientific minds in Vienna, and among her early teachers was Franz Exner, a respected physicist who directed the Physical Institute and who introduced her to the methods and standards of experimental research, teaching her the careful techniques of measurement and observation that would serve her throughout her career. Exner's laboratory was a place of practical learning, of apparatus and procedure, of the patient accumulation of data that forms the foundation of all experimental science, and Lise Meitner absorbed these lessons with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything, building her skills as an experimentalist even as her theoretical understanding deepened. The University of Vienna in those years was a center of considerable intellectual activity, and a young student of physics could hardly have asked for a better environment in which to learn the craft, surrounded by accomplished researchers and exposed to the latest developments in a field that was just beginning to reveal the strange new territories that lay beyond classical physics. But of all her teachers, it was Ludwig Boltzmann who left the deepest impression on her mind and shaped her understanding of physics most profoundly, and his lectures became for her something like a revelation, a window opening onto a vast landscape of ideas that she had never before imagined. Boltzmann was a theoretical physicist of the highest order, one of the founders of statistical mechanics, and his work on the kinetic theory of gases and the statistical interpretation of thermodynamics represented some of the most important contributions to physics in the latter half of the 19th century, though his ideas remained controversial among some of his contemporaries and the battles he fought over their acceptance had taken a considerable toll on his spirit. His teaching style was famous throughout the university for its passionate intensity, for the way he threw himself into his lectures as though physics itself were at stake in every explanation, pacing and gesturing and filling the blackboard with equations while his voice rose and fell with the drama of the ideas he was presenting, and students who attended his classes rarely forgot the experience. For Lise Meitner, encountering Boltzmann's lectures was transformative in the truest sense, changing not just what she knew about physics but how she understood the entire enterprise of scientific inquiry, revealing to her the beauty of theoretical reasoning and the power of mathematical description to illuminate the hidden structure of nature. She found in his teaching a vision of physics as a unified endeavor, a quest to understand the fundamental laws governing matter and energy, and this vision would stay with her throughout her career, informing her own approach to research and her own sense of what scientific work could achieve. Boltzmann treated his students as fellow seekers after truth, drawing them into the excitement of the questions he was pursuing, and for a young woman who had waited so long and worked so hard to reach the university, this welcoming intensity must have felt like confirmation that she had found her true calling at last. Her doctoral research was conducted under Boltzmann's nominal supervision, though the practical details of such arrangements were often less direct than the formal records suggest, and she chose to investigate the conduction of heat in inhomogeneous materials, a problem that combined theoretical interest with experimental tractability and allowed her to develop both aspects of her scientific capabilities. The work required careful measurements and mathematical analysis, the construction of apparatus and the interpretation of data, and she pursued it with the methodical patience that characterized all her research, building toward a dissertation that would earn her the doctoral degree in 1906, making her only the second woman to receive a doctorate in physics from the University of Vienna. But that same year brought tragedy as well, for in September of 1906, Ludwig Boltzmann took his own life while on holiday with his family at Duino, near Trieste, ending a struggle with depression that had worsened over the years even as his scientific reputation had continued to grow. The news of his death affected Lise Meitner deeply, as it affected all who had known him and learned from him, for he had been not only a great scientist but a generous teacher, one who had opened doors in her mind that would never close again, and his loss left a gap that could not be filled. She carried his influence with her for the rest of her career, his passionate commitment to understanding the physical world, his conviction that the deepest truths of nature were accessible to patient and rigorous inquiry, and in this way he remained with her long after his death, a guiding presence in her scientific life even as she moved on to new teachers and new challenges in the years ahead. On the first day of February in the year 1906, Lise Meitner walked into the examination hall at the University of Vienna to defend her doctoral dissertation, and though the winter light was thin and pale through the tall windows, and though her heart must surely have been beating rather quickly beneath her carefully pressed blouse, she presented herself with the quiet composure that would come to characterize her entire scientific life. She was 27 years old, which was somewhat older than many doctoral candidates, but this was entirely due to the circumstances of her earlier education rather than any deficiency in her abilities, for as we have discussed in earlier passages, women of her generation had been required to compress years of gymnasium preparation into a fraction of the time normally allotted to young men. The examination committee sat before her, these distinguished professors of physics who had watched her progress through their lecture halls and laboratories, and they prepared to evaluate the work she had completed under the supervision of Ludwig Boltzmann, that great and melancholic genius of statistical mechanics, who had seen in this young woman from the Leopoldstadt district something worth nurturing. Her dissertation bore the title Warmleitung in inhomogenein Körpern, which translates into English as heat conduction in inhomogeneous bodies, and it concerned itself with the rather technical question of how thermal energy moves through materials that are not uniform in their composition. To understand what this means, one might imagine a bar of metal that is not made of a single pure substance but rather varies in its makeup from one end to the other, perhaps containing more of one element in certain regions and less in others, and the question Meitner addressed was how heat would flow through such a complicated medium. This was not the sort of dramatic topic that would capture newspaper headlines or inspire popular imagination, but it was solid and careful physics of exactly the kind that builds the foundations upon which more spectacular discoveries eventually rest. The mathematical treatment required considerable skill, for the equations governing heat conduction become substantially more complex when one cannot assume that the material properties remain constant throughout the body in question, and Meitner demonstrated in her dissertation that she possessed both the mathematical facility and the physical intuition necessary to navigate these complications successfully. The theoretical framework she employed drew upon the work of Joseph Fourier, that French mathematician who had first described the fundamental laws of heat conduction nearly a century earlier, but extended these ideas into more general territory where the thermal conductivity of a material could vary from point to point in ways that reflected real physical situations rather than idealized simplifications. She worked through the differential equations with patience and precision, showing how the temperature distribution within such inhomogeneous bodies would evolve over time under various boundary conditions, and her examiners found her treatment to be thorough, mathematically sound, and worthy of the degree she sought. When the examination concluded and the professors had conferred amongst themselves in that formal manner characteristic of Viennese academic tradition, Lise Meitner learned that she had passed, and with this success she became only the second woman in the entire history of the University of Vienna to earn a doctoral degree in physics. The first had been Olga Steindler, who had achieved this distinction just 3 years earlier in 1903, and so Meitner joined an extraordinarily small sisterhood of women who had managed to penetrate the masculine fortress of university physics education in the Habsburg Empire. One might expect that such an achievement would have opened immediate doors to academic employment or research positions, but the reality of early 20th century Europe was rather different from such optimistic imaginings, and Meitner found herself in the uncertain position common to many young scholars of that era, which is to say that she had proven her capabilities but had no clear path forward upon which to walk. She returned to her family home in Vienna, to the apartment where her parents and siblings still resided, and there she contemplated what she might do next with this hard-won qualification that society was not yet prepared to properly recognize or reward. The months following her doctoral examination were characterized by a kind of suspended uncertainty, a period of waiting and wondering that must have been difficult for someone of her intellectual energy and ambition. She had proven that she could do physics at the highest academic level, that she could wrestle with complex theoretical problems and emerge victorious, but the question of how to continue doing physics as a professional vocation remained stubbornly unanswered. There were no faculty positions available to women at Austrian universities, for such appointments were simply not made regardless of how qualified the candidate might be, and the research institutes that employed scientists were similarly closed to female applicants. It was a frustrating situation, this gap between demonstrated capability and permitted opportunity, and Meitner navigated it with the patient determination that would sustain her through many similar obstacles in the decades to come. She eventually took a position teaching at a girls' school in Vienna, one of those educational institutions that prepared young women for the kinds of futures that society deemed appropriate for their sex, which generally did not include careers in scientific research. The work was respectable and provided some income, though teaching secondary students was rather different from the research she longed to pursue, and one imagines that she stood before her classes explaining the principles of physics while part of her mind wandered toward the deeper questions that truly engaged her curiosity. But Meitner did not allow her teaching duties to entirely consume her scientific ambitions, and during this year of classroom instruction she continued to work independently on research problems, maintaining her connection to the world of active physics even as her official employment lay elsewhere. It was during this period that she published her first scientific paper, which appeared in the year 1906 and concerned the absorption of alpha and beta radiation in metals. This was a significant departure from the theoretical heat conduction work of her dissertation, representing instead an engagement with the exciting new field of radioactivity that was then transforming physics in ways that no one fully understood. Alpha particles and beta particles were two of the mysterious emissions that certain elements produced spontaneously, and understanding how these particles interacted with ordinary matter was essential for both practical and theoretical reasons. Meitner's paper examined how metals of different types absorbed these radiations, measuring the penetrating power of alpha and beta particles through thin metallic sheets and contributing to the growing body of experimental knowledge about these phenomena. It was careful work, precisely executed and clearly reported, and it marked her entry into the scientific literature as an independent researcher rather than merely a student completing a required thesis. Her growing fascination with radioactivity had been sparked by reading about the work of Marie and Pierre Curie, those remarkable scientists in Paris who had discovered polonium and radium and who had shown that certain elements possessed the almost magical property of spontaneously emitting energetic radiation without any apparent external cause. The Curie's discoveries had captured the imagination of physicists throughout Europe, for here was something genuinely new, something that seemed to challenge the established understanding of matter and energy, and Meitner found herself drawn irresistibly toward this frontier of knowledge. She read the papers coming out of Paris with intense interest, following the careful measurements and bold interpretations that were gradually revealing the strange behavior of radioactive substances, and she began to envision herself contributing to this revolutionary field rather than remaining confined to the more traditional topics of her doctoral work. The question of how to pursue this vision was complicated by practical considerations, chief among them being the matter of financial support, for advanced scientific training required both time and money, and a young woman teaching at a girls' school had limited quantities of both. It was here that Lise Meitner's father, Philip Meitner, played a crucial role in enabling his daughter's scientific future, for he agreed to provide her with the financial backing necessary to continue her studies beyond the doctorate. This was not a small commitment, as it meant supporting an adult child in an unconventional pursuit with no guaranteed outcome, but Philip Meitner had always encouraged his daughter's intellectual development, and he apparently believed that Lise's abilities warranted this investment. His support freed her from the necessity of earning her living through teaching and allowed her to contemplate more ambitious plans for her scientific development. The decision that would shape the entire course of her subsequent career began to take form during this period of teaching and independent research, as Meitner considered where she might go to deepen her understanding of physics and position herself at the forefront of the new radioactivity research. Her first thought, quite naturally, was to go to Paris and work with Marie Curie herself, for who better to learn from than the woman who had pioneered this field and who continued to make discovery after discovery in her laboratory at the Sorbonne. The idea of studying under Madame Curie must have been tremendously appealing, offering as it did the chance to learn directly from the master and to work in the very place where radium had first been isolated and its remarkable properties first demonstrated. Meitner seriously considered this option, turning it over in her mind and contemplating what it would mean to relocate to France and join the circle of researchers gathered around the most famous woman scientist in the world. But in the end she chose differently, selecting Berlin rather than Paris as her destination for further study, and this choice was motivated primarily by the presence of Max Planck at the University of Berlin. Planck had recently proposed his quantum hypothesis, that revolutionary idea that energy comes in discrete packets rather than continuous flows, and his lectures on theoretical physics were renowned throughout the scientific world for their depth and clarity. Meitner was drawn to the rigorous theoretical foundations that Planck could provide, sensing perhaps that the new physics of radioactivity would ultimately require the kind of fundamental theoretical understanding that only someone of Planck's caliber could impart. There may have been other considerations as well, practical matters of language and cultural familiarity, for German was Meitner's native tongue while French would have required additional effort to master at the level needed for advanced scientific work. But the primary attraction was undoubtedly Planck himself and the quality of physics instruction available in the Prussian capital. She planned initially to stay in Berlin for just 1 year, attending Planck's lectures and absorbing as much theoretical physics as possible before returning to Vienna or moving on to some other opportunity. This modest timeline would prove to be spectacularly wrong, for Berlin would become her home for more than 30 years, but in the autumn of 1907 when she made her preparations to depart, she imagined herself as a temporary visitor rather than a permanent resident of the German capital. She packed her belongings, said farewell to her family, and undertook the journey northward from Vienna through the landscapes of the Habsburg and Hohenzollern empires, traveling from the city of waltzes and coffeehouses to the city of military parades and Prussian efficiency. The cultural adjustment required by this move was more substantial than mere geography might suggest, for Vienna and Berlin, though both German-speaking capitals of great empires, possessed distinctly different characters that shaped daily life in countless small ways. Vienna had a certain relaxed elegance, a tendency toward conversation and sociability, a culture that valued charm and aesthetic refinement alongside more serious pursuits, and this was the atmosphere in which Meitner had grown up and formed her personality. Berlin, by contrast, was harder and more angular, a city where Prussian discipline and northern Protestant austerity set the tone, where punctuality was a moral virtue and idle pleasantries were viewed with some suspicion. The Viennese manner of easing into topics gradually, of softening direct statements with courteous circumlocutions, gave way in Berlin to a more blunt and businesslike style of interaction that could seem almost rude to someone accustomed to Austrian ways. Meitner noticed these differences keenly in her early months in the Prussian capital, feeling herself something of a foreigner despite the shared language, and she would later recall the adjustment period as requiring some considerable effort. The winters were colder, the people seemed less warm, and the entire rhythm of city life moved to a different tempo than she had known in Vienna. But she had come to Berlin for Max Planck and for physics, not for cultural comfort, and she applied herself to her studies with the same determination that had carried her through her doctoral work, trusting that the scientific rewards would justify the personal sacrifices involved in this relocation. As she settled into her new surroundings and began attending the lectures that had drawn her northward, Lise Meitner could not have known that she was beginning a chapter of her life that would extend far beyond the single year she had planned, that Berlin would witness her greatest scientific achievements and her most painful professional struggles, that the city would eventually betray her in ways she could not then imagine, but also that it would first provide her with the opportunities and collaborations that would make her one of the most important physicists of the 20th century. For now, in the autumn of 1907, she was simply a young Austrian woman with a fresh doctorate and a burning curiosity about the nature of matter, sitting in a lecture hall and listening to Max Planck explain the foundations of theoretical physics, taking careful notes and preparing herself for whatever might come next. In the autumn of 1907, Lise Meitner arrived in Berlin, carrying with her the freshly completed doctoral degree from Vienna and a quiet determination that would shape the course of nuclear physics for decades to come. She was 28 years old, small in stature, reserved in manner, and possessed of a mathematical mind that had already distinguished her among her professors in Austria. Berlin in those years was the undisputed center of theoretical physics, a city where the greatest minds of the age gathered to lecture and debate and push forward the boundaries of human understanding, and Meitner had come there with a modest plan to spend perhaps a year or two continuing her studies before returning home to teach. She could not have known then that Berlin would become her home for more than 3 decades, or that the work she would begin in a basement workshop would eventually help unlock the secrets held within the atomic nucleus itself. The journey from Vienna had been long, and the city that greeted her was vast and imposing in the way that great capitals often are, with its grand boulevards and its serious grey buildings and its air of intellectual purpose. Meitner found lodgings and oriented herself to this new environment with the careful methodical approach that characterized everything she did. Her primary intention was to attend the lectures of Max Planck, who had only 7 years earlier proposed his revolutionary quantum hypothesis and who was widely regarded as one of the most important physicists then living. To study under Planck was an opportunity of the highest order, and Meitner had written to him in advance to request permission to attend his courses on theoretical physics. Here we encounter a small but telling detail about the times in which Meitner lived and worked. Max Planck, for all his brilliance and his willingness to overturn established thinking in physics, held rather conventional views about the role of women in academic life. He had written and spoken on the subject, expressing his belief that women were generally unsuited to scientific careers, that their talents lay elsewhere, and that only in the rarest of exceptional cases might a woman possess the necessary aptitude for serious intellectual work. One might expect, given these views, that he would have turned away the young woman from Vienna who wished to sit in his lecture hall. But Planck was also a man of intellectual honesty, and when he met Meitner and spoke with her about physics, he recognized in her precisely that rare exception he had allowed for in his writings. He granted her permission to attend his lectures, and over time he would become one of her most steadfast supporters, a mentor and friend who championed her work even as the broader culture continued to place obstacles in her path. And so Meitner took her place in Planck's lecture hall, one of very few women in a sea of male students and professors, and she absorbed the theoretical foundations that would inform all of her subsequent research. Planck's approach to physics was rigorous and mathematical, concerned with the deep principles underlying natural phenomena, and this suited Meitner's own temperament perfectly. She had always been drawn to the theoretical side of physics, to the elegant equations and the fundamental laws, and under Planck's guidance she refined her understanding and sharpened her analytical skills. But theoretical physics alone was not her aim. She wished to conduct experimental research as well, to test ideas against the physical world, and this desire led her to a meeting that would define her scientific life. It was at one of the physics colloquia held regularly in Berlin, where researchers gathered to present their work and discuss the latest developments in their fields, that Meitner first encountered a young German chemist named Otto Hahn. Hahn was just a year older than Meitner, cheerful and sociable where she was reserved, trained in chemistry rather than physics, and already gaining a reputation for his work on radioactive substances. He had studied under Ernest Rutherford in Montreal and under William Ramsay in London, and he had returned to Berlin with expertise in the chemical separation of radioactive elements, a skill that was much in demand as researchers struggled to identify and isolate the bewildering array of radioactive substances being discovered in those years. Their first meeting was informal, as such meetings often are at academic gatherings, and Hahn later recalled his initial impression of the young Austrian physicist. She struck him as rather shy and retiring, with dark hair and a serious expression, and she spoke quietly but with evident precision about her interest in radioactivity. Hahn for his part was outgoing and friendly, quick to laugh and easy in conversation, the sort of person who put others at ease. Despite their different temperaments, or perhaps because of them, they found an immediate rapport. Both were young researchers at the beginning of their careers, both were deeply interested in the mysterious phenomena of radioactivity, and crucially, their skills were complementary in a way that would prove extraordinarily productive. Hahn possessed the chemical knowledge necessary to separate and purify radioactive substances, to identify elements and isolate them from the complex mixtures in which they occurred. Meitner possessed the physics training necessary to understand the radiation these substances emitted, to measure it precisely, and to interpret what those measurements revealed about the underlying atomic processes. Together, they realized, they might accomplish what neither could do alone. They agreed to collaborate, and here we must pause to consider the practical difficulties this arrangement entailed. Hahn worked at the Chemical Institute directed by Emil Fischer, a Nobel laureate in chemistry and a figure of considerable authority in the German academic establishment. Fischer's institute was well equipped for chemical research, with modern laboratories and all the necessary apparatus, but it operated under strict rules regarding the presence of women. Fischer himself was not unkind, but he was a man of his time and his institution, and he had decreed that women were not permitted to enter the laboratories where male students conducted their work. The reasoning behind this prohibition was never made entirely explicit, but it reflected the widespread assumption that the presence of women in scientific spaces would be disruptive or inappropriate, that the serious work of research required an exclusively male environment. For Meitner, this meant that she could not simply walk into Hahn's laboratory and begin working alongside him. A separate space had to be found, and the space that was found was hardly ideal. In the basement of the Chemical Institute there was a former carpentry workshop, a modest room that had been used for woodworking and construction tasks, and this room was made available to Meitner for her research. It was not connected to the main laboratories, it lacked many basic amenities, and it had its own entrance from the street so that Meitner could come and go without passing through the building proper. The arrangement was designed to preserve the fiction that she was not really present in the institute at all, that her work was somehow separate from the male domain upstairs. The workshop was adequate for some purposes but deficient in others, and certain basic necessities were simply unavailable. There was, for instance, no women's lavatory in the building, because women were not supposed to be there. When Meitner needed to use such facilities, she had to leave the institute and walk down the street to a nearby restaurant that would allow her to use their restroom. This she did for years, in all weather, a small indignity that she bore without complaint, but that speaks volumes about the conditions under which she labored. One imagines her making that walk in the grey Berlin winters, through rain and snow, a brilliant physicist who could not use a toilet in her own workplace because her presence was officially not acknowledged. And yet she persisted, because the work itself was what mattered to her, and the work was deeply absorbing. In that basement workshop, with its plain walls and its makeshift equipment, Meitner and Hahn began their investigations into radioactivity. Their collaboration was remarkably smooth from the beginning, characterized by mutual respect and a clear division of responsibilities. Hahn would obtain radioactive samples and perform the chemical separations necessary to isolate particular elements or isotopes. Meitner would then take these purified samples and measure their radiation, designing experiments to reveal the properties of the emissions and the behavior of the decaying atoms. They would discuss their results together, interpret the data, plan the next steps, and gradually build up a coherent picture of the phenomena they were studying. Their early work focused on beta radiation, the stream of electrons emitted by certain radioactive substances during their decay. Beta radiation was not as well understood as alpha radiation in those years, and its properties were still being mapped out by researchers around the world. Meitner's physics training gave her the tools to analyze the energy and behavior of these beta particles, while Hahn's chemical skills ensured that the samples they studied were properly identified and free from contaminating substances. Together they made careful measurements and published their findings, contributing to the growing body of knowledge about radioactive processes. One of their notable early achievements was the study of radioactive recoil, a phenomenon that occurs when an atom emits an alpha particle during radioactive decay. The alpha particle is ejected at high speed in one direction, and by the conservation of momentum, the remaining atom must recoil in the opposite direction. This recoil is quite small because the atom is much heavier than the alpha particle, but it is measurable and it has important consequences for the behavior of radioactive substances on surfaces and in thin films. Meitner and Hahn investigated this phenomenon carefully, designing experiments to detect and measure the recoil effect, and their work helped establish the physical understanding of how radioactive decay affected the atoms involved. Throughout this period, Meitner worked without any official position and without salary. She supported herself using a small allowance sent by her family in Vienna, living frugally in rented rooms and devoting herself entirely to her research. This situation was not unusual for women in academia at the time, who were often denied the paid positions available to their male colleagues, but it placed a constant strain on Meitner's circumstances. She could not remain in Berlin indefinitely on family support alone, yet she had no clear path to a paying position. The German academic system had no place for women on its official rolls, no faculty positions they could hold, no salaries they could draw. Meitner existed in a kind of institutional limbo, present and productive but officially invisible. It was not until 1912 that this situation changed, when Planck appointed her as his assistant, finally giving her a salaried position and an official role in the physics establishment. But that lay some years in the future, and in the meantime she continued her unpaid work in the basement workshop, driven by her love of the science and her partnership with Hahn. In 1909, their work on radioactive recoil was sufficiently advanced that they were invited to present it at a major scientific conference in Salzburg. This gathering brought together many of the leading physicists of the age, and it provided an opportunity for Meitner to share her research with a wider audience and to meet colleagues from other institutions. Among the scientists present at Salzburg was Albert Einstein, who had already published his revolutionary papers on special relativity and the photoelectric effect, but who was not yet the world-famous figure he would later become. Meitner met Einstein for the first time at this conference, and though the details of their conversation have not been preserved, the encounter marked the beginning of an acquaintance that would continue over the years. The Salzburg Conference was a milestone for Meitner, a recognition that her work was gaining attention and respect within the physics community. She presented her findings on radioactive recoil with her characteristic clarity and precision, demonstrating the careful experimental technique and the thorough physical analysis that would become hallmarks of her career. The work she and Hahn had done in that modest basement workshop was now being discussed by the leading scientists of Europe, and though she remained without an official position or salary, her reputation was growing. These early Berlin years established the pattern that would characterize the Meitner-Hahn partnership for decades to come. Two scientists of different training and temperament, united by shared curiosity and complementary skills, working together to understand the strange behavior of radioactive matter. They would go on to make many more discoveries, some of them among the most important in the history of physics, but the foundations were laid in those first years of collaboration, in a converted carpentry workshop in a basement, where a young woman was not allowed to use the facilities but was allowed, just barely, to do extraordinary science. In the year 1912, Lise Meitner received an appointment that had never before been granted to a woman in the Kingdom of Prussia, for Max Planck, the great theoretical physicist whose work on black-body radiation had quietly revolutionized the understanding of energy itself, invited her to become his assistant at the University of Berlin, and this position, though it may sound modest to modern ears, represented something rather extraordinary in its time, a formal recognition that a woman could hold a scientific post within the rigid hierarchies of Prussian academia, and Meitner, who had spent years working without pay in a converted carpentry workshop, who had entered the physics building through basement doors to avoid disturbing the sensibilities of those who believed women had no place in such institutions, now found herself with an official title and a small but regular salary, and she could walk through the main entrance of the university like any other member of the faculty, though of course the deeper prejudices of the era did not dissolve overnight, and she remained acutely aware that her presence was tolerated rather than celebrated by many of her colleagues. That same year brought another change in her circumstances, for the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which had been established just the year before with generous funding from German industry and the imperial government, opened its new Institute for Chemistry in the leafy suburb of Dahlem, on the southwestern edge of Berlin, where the air was cleaner and the pace of life somewhat slower than in the crowded city center, and Otto Hahn, her collaborator and friend, received an appointment there, and, through arrangements that required considerable negotiation given her gender, Meitner was permitted to establish her own small physics section within the Chemistry Institute, a space where she could pursue her research into radioactivity with greater independence than she had previously enjoyed, and the laboratories in Dahlem were modern and well-equipped, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the grey Berlin light, and the institute was surrounded by gardens and pine trees, a peaceful setting that seemed far removed from the tensions building across the European continent, though of course those tensions would soon enough reach even this quiet corner of the scientific world. The summer of 1914 began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, an event that seemed distant and contained at first, a matter for diplomats and military men rather than physicists and chemists, but within weeks the intricate web of alliances and animosities that had developed among the great powers of Europe pulled nation after nation into war, and Germany found itself fighting on two fronts, against France and Britain in the west and against Russia in the east, and the young men who had filled the lecture halls and laboratories began to disappear into military uniforms, and scientific research, which had seemed so important just months before, suddenly appeared almost frivolous in comparison with the vast machinery of destruction that was grinding into motion across the continent, and Otto Hahn, like so many German chemists, was called upon to contribute his expertise to the war effort, and he became involved in the development of chemical weapons, a work that would trouble him for the rest of his life, while Meitner, as an Austrian citizen living in Germany, found herself in an ambiguous position, not quite at home in either country, watching as the world she had known transformed into something darker and more dangerous. By 1915, Meitner had made her own decision about how to serve during the war, and she volunteered as an X-ray nurse technician with the Austrian army, traveling to the Eastern Front, where the fighting between the Austro-Hungarian and Russian forces had produced casualties on a scale that the medical services were utterly unprepared to handle, and her training in physics gave her the technical knowledge to operate the X-ray equipment that was used to locate bullets and shrapnel. fragments lodged in the bodies of wounded soldiers, and she worked in field hospitals behind the lines, in buildings that had been hastily converted from schools or churches or private homes, where the wounded arrived in endless streams, young men with shattered limbs and torn flesh, and the X-ray machines, which had seemed like such elegant instruments of scientific discovery in the peaceful laboratories of Berlin, now served a grimmer purpose, revealing the damage that modern weapons could inflict upon the human body. And Meitner, who had spent her adult life studying the invisible radiations emitted by atoms, now used those same radiations to peer inside the broken bodies of soldiers, and the experience marked her deeply, though she rarely spoke of it in later years, for the carnage she witnessed was not something that could be easily translated into words, and the memory of those months stayed with her, a reminder of what human beings were capable of doing to one another when the restraints of civilization were stripped away. During her time away from Berlin, Meitner maintained a correspondence with Otto Hahn, letters that traveled slowly across the disrupted postal networks of wartime Europe, and in these letters they discussed not only personal matters but also scientific questions, for even amid the chaos of war, the desire to understand the natural world did not entirely disappear, and Hahn, despite his involvement in military research, continued to think about the radioactive elements they had studied together. And Meitner, in whatever spare moments she could find between her duties at the field hospital, considered the theoretical problems that had occupied her before the war, and their letters formed a thread of continuity, a reminder that somewhere beyond the trenches and the bombardments, there existed a world of ideas and discoveries that might one day be resumed. In 1916, Meitner returned to Berlin and to her work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and though the war continued and the city was grey with shortages and anxiety, she threw herself back into research with a determination that seemed almost fierce, as if the work itself offered a refuge from the horrors she had witnessed, and she and Hahn resumed their collaboration, pursuing a problem that had occupied radioactive chemists for several years, the identification of a missing element in the decay chain of uranium, an element with atomic number 91 that was predicted to exist but had not yet been isolated and characterized, and this was painstaking work, requiring the processing of large quantities of radioactive material and the careful separation of minute traces of different elements, and the techniques involved were demanding and sometimes dangerous, for the materials they handled emitted radiations that could damage living tissue, though the full extent of these dangers was not yet understood. Working in their laboratories in Dahlem, while Berlin struggled under wartime rationing and the news from the fronts grew ever more grim, Meitner and Hahn succeeded in isolating the elusive element, which they named protactinium, meaning the parent of actinium, because it decayed into that element through the emission of an alpha particle, and their discovery was published in 1918, just as the war was reaching its catastrophic conclusion, and they had beaten their rivals, the British chemist Frederick Soddy and the Polish-born Kosimir Fajans, who had been working on the same problem, and this success established Meitner and Hahn as a formidable team, capable of work at the very highest level of radioactive research, and it demonstrated that Meitner's contributions were not merely auxiliary or supportive but essential and original, that she was not simply Hahn's assistant but his equal partner in discovery. The year 1917 also brought a formal recognition of Meitner's standing within the institute, for she was appointed head of the physics department, a position that gave her authority over her own research program and her own staff, and she was the first woman to hold such a position at a Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and though the appointment came with responsibilities and administrative burdens, it also brought a degree of independence that she had long sought, and she could now pursue her own scientific interests without constantly having to justify her presence or her competence to skeptical colleagues. The end of the war in November 1918 brought not peace and prosperity but chaos and hardship, for Germany had been defeated, and the Kaiser had fled, and the new Weimar Republic struggled to establish itself amid political violence and economic turmoil, and the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles placed an enormous burden on the German economy, and in the years that followed, the currency began to collapse, slowly at first and then with terrifying speed, until by 1923 a loaf of bread cost billions of marks and workers collected their wages in wheelbarrows and spent them within hours before the money lost all value, and Meitner, like everyone else in Germany, struggled with these conditions, and there were times when basic necessities were difficult to obtain, when heating fuel was scarce in winter and food was rationed, and the elegant laboratories in Dahlem seemed almost absurd amid such privation, temples of pure research in a society that could barely feed itself, and yet the work continued, for what else was there to do, and the pursuit of knowledge offered at least the consolation of order and meaning in a world that seemed to have lost both. In 1922, Meitner delivered her habilitation lecture at the University of Berlin, a formal requirement for those who wished to teach at the university level in the German academic system, and her topic was cosmic physics, the study of radiations and particles that arrived at Earth from distant regions of space, and this lecture represented another milestone, another barrier overcome, for she was among the first women to complete this qualification in physics in Germany, and it opened the possibility of a professorship, though such appointments remained difficult for women to obtain and would continue to be so for many years. It was during this period that Albert Einstein, who had become the most famous physicist in the world following the confirmation of his general theory of relativity in 1919, referred to Meitner as our Madame Curie, a comparison that was surely meant as a compliment, for Marie Curie was the only woman who had achieved comparable recognition in the field of radioactive research, but Meitner was uncomfortable with the comparison, not because she did not admire Curie, whom she respected greatly, but because she wished to be recognized for her own work rather than as a German version of someone else, and she felt that the comparison, however well-intentioned, reduced her to a type rather than acknowledging her as an individual with her own distinctive contributions, and this discomfort reflected a broader frustration that would persist throughout her career, the sense that her gender was always the first thing that others noticed about her, that she was always a woman physicist rather than simply a physicist, and she wanted nothing more than to be judged by the same standards as her male colleagues, without special allowances or condescending praise. In 1923, while working on the emission of electrons from atoms that had been exposed to radiation, Meitner observed a phenomenon that would later become known as the Auger effect, named after the French physicist Pierre Auger, who described the same process a few years later, and this effect involves the emission of an electron from an atom that has been ionized, where the energy released by an electron falling into a lower energy state is transferred not to a photon but to another electron, which is then ejected from the atom, and this was a subtle and important observation, revealing something fundamental about the way energy is redistributed within atoms, and Meitner published her findings, but she did so in a somewhat less prominent manner than Auger would later employ, and as a result, his name became attached to the effect rather than hers, and this pattern, where her contributions were overlooked or attributed to others, would recur throughout her career, a source of quiet frustration that she bore with characteristic dignity, for she knew the value of her own work even if others sometimes failed to recognize it. And so the years passed, from the hopeful promise of 1912, when she had received her appointment as Planck's assistant and moved to the new institute in Dahlem, through the darkness of the war and the chaos of its aftermath, to the precarious stability of the early Weimar Republic, and Meitner continued her work, measuring and calculating, designing experiments and interpreting results, contributing piece by piece to the growing understanding of the atomic world, and though she did not know it yet, the most important discovery of her life still lay ahead, waiting in the nucleus of the uranium atom, a discovery that would change the world in ways she could scarcely have imagined. The years that followed the tumult of the Great War brought with them a kind of flowering in German physics, a period of remarkable intellectual abundance that would later be remembered as something of a golden age, and it was during this time that Lise Meitner came into the fullness of her scientific career, establishing herself not merely as a competent researcher but as one of the foremost authorities in her field, a figure of genuine stature in a community that included some of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century. The 1920s in Berlin were years of extraordinary ferment, when the old certainties of classical physics were giving way to the strange new landscape of quantum mechanics, when young theorists were rewriting the fundamental laws of nature, and when experimentalists like Meitner were probing the innermost structure of the atom with ever more refined techniques, and through it all she maintained her steady, methodical approach, her insistence on precision, her quiet determination to understand the natural world on its own terms. In 1926, a recognition came to Meitner that marked a significant milestone not only in her own career but in the history of German academia more broadly, for in that year she was appointed to a position as extraordinary professor of physics at the University of Berlin, becoming in doing so the first woman ever to hold a full professorship in physics at a German university, a distinction that she accepted with her characteristic modesty even as it represented the overcoming of barriers that had seemed insurmountable only a generation before. The appointment was fitting acknowledgement of the work she had been doing for nearly 2 decades, the careful accumulation of knowledge about radioactive substances and their emissions, the development of experimental methods that had become standard in laboratories around the world, and yet one can imagine that for Meitner herself the title mattered less than the work it enabled her to continue, for she was never one to seek honors for their own sake, preferring always the quiet satisfactions of the laboratory to the more public forms of recognition. Her research group at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry had by this time grown into a small but dedicated community of younger scientists who came to work under her guidance, drawn by her reputation for rigorous thinking and her willingness to engage deeply with the problems her students brought to her, and the atmosphere she cultivated was one of serious purpose combined with genuine warmth, a place where difficult questions could be pursued with patience and where the standards were high but the criticism was always constructive. Meitner was not an effusive mentor, not given to excessive praise or displays of emotion, but those who worked closely with her came to understand that her quiet attention was itself a form of encouragement, that when she listened carefully to an idea and asked her probing questions, she was taking you seriously as a scientist, and this was perhaps the greatest gift she could offer. She expected much of her students, expected them to think clearly and to know their subject thoroughly, but she also gave much in return, sharing her time and her expertise generously, treating even the most junior members of her group as colleagues engaged in a common enterprise. Among the many friendships that Meitner cultivated during these years, several stand out as particularly significant to her intellectual and personal life: relationships with fellow physicists who shared her passion for understanding the natural world and with whom she could discuss the latest developments in their rapidly evolving field. James Franck was one such friend, a physicist whose work on electron collisions with atoms had helped to establish the quantum nature of atomic energy levels, and whose warm personality and sharp scientific mind made him a valued companion at conferences and colloquia. Max von Laue was another close associate, the man who had discovered the diffraction of X-rays by crystals and who shared Meitner's commitment to careful experimental work and clear theoretical thinking, and the two would often be found in conversation at the various gatherings that brought the Berlin physics community together. There was also a younger generation coming up, promising scientists who would go on to make their own contributions to knowledge, and among these was Max Delbruck, a young physicist who would later turn his attention to biology and help to found the field of molecular genetics, but who in those Berlin years was part of the lively intellectual scene that Meitner inhabited, one of the many bright young minds who benefited from contact with her rigorous approach to scientific questions. The Wednesday colloquia at the University of Berlin were a central institution in the life of the physics community, gatherings where researchers would present their latest findings and submit them to the scrutiny of their peers, and Meitner was a regular and notable presence at these events, known for the penetrating questions she would ask from her seat in the audience, queries that cut to the heart of whatever matter was under discussion and that speakers learned to anticipate with a mixture of respect and mild apprehension. Her questions were never hostile, never intended to embarrass or to score points, but they were invariably precise, revealing whether a speaker had truly thought through the implications of their work or was glossing over difficulties in the hope that no one would notice. This reputation for rigorous questioning was entirely consistent with her approach to her own research, where she held herself to the same exacting standards, unwilling to publish a result until she was confident it would withstand the most careful examination, and it earned her the deep respect of her colleagues even as it occasionally made less prepared speakers nervous to see her in the audience. The research that occupied Meitner during these years was focused primarily on the emissions from radioactive nuclei, the various types of radiation that emerged when atoms underwent their mysterious transformations, and in particular she devoted considerable attention to the study of beta rays, those fast-moving electrons that were ejected from certain unstable nuclei. The measurement of beta ray spectra was a technically demanding enterprise, requiring careful experimental design and painstaking attention to the many sources of error that could compromise one's results, and Meitner brought to this work all of her considerable skill as an experimentalist, refining the techniques and accumulating data of unprecedented precision. She was also deeply engaged with the study of gamma radiation, those high-energy photons that accompanied many nuclear decays, and her work in this area helped to clarify the complex relationships between the different types of emission, building up a more complete picture of what was happening within the atomic nucleus during these processes. A particular achievement of this period came in 1930, When Meitner published a paper that correctly interpreted a phenomenon that would come to be known as pair production, the creation of an electron and its antimatter counterpart, the positron, from a high-energy photon interacting with the electric field of a nucleus. This was subtle and difficult physics, requiring both experimental acuity to observe the effect clearly and theoretical insight to understand what one was seeing, and Meitner's correct interpretation represented a significant contribution to the emerging understanding of how matter and energy could be transformed into one another under the right conditions. The positron itself had not yet been formally discovered at the time of her paper, and so the full implications of her work would only become clear in the years that followed, but her analysis demonstrated once again her ability to extract meaning from complex experimental data, to see through to the underlying physics even when the phenomena were novel and poorly understood. By the mid-1920s, Meitner's name was beginning to appear on the lists of candidates nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics, a recognition of the growing esteem in which her work was held by the international scientific community, and these nominations would continue throughout the following years, submitted by various prominent scientists who believed that her contributions warranted the highest honor their profession could bestow. The nominations did not lead to an award during this period, but they were nonetheless significant as indicators of her standing, evidence that her peers considered her work to be of the first rank and worthy of consideration alongside the most important discoveries of the age. One may note in passing that the Nobel committees of this era were not always quick to recognize the achievements of women scientists, and that Meitner's repeated nominations without success may have reflected something more than purely scientific judgments, but such considerations were not ones that Meitner herself dwelt upon, preferring to let her work speak for itself and to continue with her research regardless of whether external honors followed. The social life of the Berlin physics community during these golden years was rich and varied, extending well beyond the formal settings of colloquia and conferences to include dinners, musical evenings, and informal gatherings where scientists and their families would come together in a spirit of friendly collegiality. Meitner was a welcome presence at many such events, valued for her intelligence and her quiet wit, for the thoughtful observations she would offer on whatever subject was under discussion, and for the genuine interest she took in the lives and work of her colleagues. Among the families with whom she was particularly close were the Plancks, for Max Planck and his wife had befriended Meitner early in her Berlin years, recognizing in her a kindred spirit and welcoming her into their home with warmth and generosity. The Planck household was a center of musical and intellectual culture, a place where one might hear excellent chamber music and engage in stimulating conversation, and Meitner's friendship with the family remained a source of comfort and pleasure throughout her Berlin years, one of the anchors of her personal life in a period of intense professional activity. Despite her growing eminence, Meitner maintained throughout these years a modest way of living that reflected her fundamental lack of interest in material display or social status. Her apartment in Berlin-Dahlem was comfortable but unpretentious, a place suited to a scholar of simple tastes who required little beyond books, a piano, and the peace necessary for concentrated thought. She dressed plainly and lived frugally, spending her money on the occasional concert ticket or book rather than on luxuries, and those who knew her understood that this simplicity was not a pose but a genuine expression of her values, a reflection of the fact that her deepest satisfactions came from her work and her friendships rather than from possessions or appearances. The apartment in Dahlem was conveniently close to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, allowing her to walk to work through the quiet streets of that leafy suburb, a daily journey that she made in all seasons, her mind often occupied with whatever problem was currently commanding her attention. Each summer, when the pace of work at the institute slowed and the heat of the city became oppressive, Meitner would make her way to the Austrian Alps, returning to the landscapes of her homeland for hiking trips that provided both physical refreshment and spiritual renewal. She was a strong and enthusiastic walker, capable of covering considerable distances over rough terrain, and she found in the mountains a kind of peace that complemented the intellectual satisfactions of her laboratory work, a reminder of the grandeur and indifference of the natural world that put even the most exciting scientific discoveries into a broader perspective. These summer excursions were often undertaken in the company of friends, fellow scientists who shared her love of mountain walking, and the combination of fresh air, stunning scenery, and good conversation made these trips highlights of her year, interludes of freedom between the more structured months of research and teaching. During this period, Meitner received an offer of a position at the University of Vienna, an invitation to return to the city of her birth and her early education, to take up a prestigious chair in the country where she had first developed her love of physics. It was in some ways an attractive proposition, an opportunity to come home after so many years abroad, but after careful consideration Meitner declined the offer, choosing to remain in Berlin where the intellectual atmosphere suited her so well and where she had built a life and a network of colleagues that she was reluctant to leave. Vienna was a fine city with a respectable scientific community, but Berlin in the 1920s was something more, a world center of physics where the most exciting work was being done and where one could encounter the leading figures of the field simply by attending the weekly colloquium or accepting an invitation to dinner. For Meitner, who had worked so hard to establish herself in this environment, who had overcome so many obstacles to reach her current position, the choice to stay was perhaps not difficult, for Berlin had become her true home in every sense that mattered to her. And so the years of the golden decade passed, each one bringing new discoveries and new challenges, new students to train and new problems to solve, and through it all Meitner continued her steady work, building her reputation and contributing to the collective enterprise of understanding the atomic nucleus, unaware as yet of the shadows that were gathering at the edges of this bright period, the political storms that would soon sweep across Germany and change everything. But for now, in the warmth of these productive years, she was simply a scientist doing what she loved, surrounded by colleagues she respected and friends she cherished, engaged in work that gave her life meaning and purpose. In the early months of 1933, a shadow began to fall across the institutes and lecture halls of Germany, a shadow that would grow longer and darker with each passing season until it had transformed the landscape of European science in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. The National Socialist Party had come to power in January of that year, and within weeks the character of daily life in Berlin began to shift in subtle and then not so subtle ways, with flags appearing on buildings and new phrases entering the newspapers and a certain tension settling into conversations that had once flowed easily between colleagues. Lise Meitner, now in her mid-50s and long established as one of the most respected physicists in Germany, watched these changes from her laboratory at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry, where she had worked for more than 2 decades and where her days still followed the familiar rhythms of experimentation and calculation and the quiet satisfactions of scientific inquiry. The legislation that would reshape German academia arrived in April of that year, when the government passed what was formerly called the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, though its purpose was not restoration but rather exclusion, specifically the removal of Jewish individuals and those deemed politically unreliable from positions in government employment, including the universities. The law contained provisions that required the dismissal of civil servants of non-Aryan descent, and because university professors in Germany held their positions as civil servants, the impact on academic life was immediate and profound. Across the country, scholars who had dedicated their lives to teaching and research found themselves suddenly stripped of their positions, their access to laboratories, their students, and in many cases their sense of belonging in the only professional community they had ever known. Meitner's situation was complicated by her particular circumstances, for she was not a German citizen but rather an Austrian one, having been born in Vienna and having retained her Austrian nationality throughout her many years of residence in Berlin. This accident of citizenship provided her with a degree of protection that her German-born colleagues of Jewish heritage did not possess, as the initial racial laws applied primarily to German nationals. She was permitted to keep her position at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and for a time it seemed that she might be able to continue her work without the immediate threat of dismissal. However, the protections afforded by her foreign citizenship were partial and fragile, and she soon discovered their limits when she was informed that she could no longer deliver lectures at the University of Berlin, where she had taught for many years. The right to teach, which she had fought so long and so patiently to obtain in her early career, was now taken from her by administrative decree, and though she could still conduct her research at the institute, she was no longer permitted to stand before students and share the knowledge she had accumulated over a lifetime of careful study. The losses that German science suffered in those early years of the Nazi regime were staggering in their scope, as one distinguished figure after another departed for safer shores or was forced from their position. James Franck, who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1925 for his experimental work on the quantum nature of electron collisions with atoms, resigned his professorship at Göttingen in April of 1933 rather than dismiss his Jewish colleagues as the new laws required. His resignation was a public act of conscience that drew both admiration and hostility, and he would eventually make his way to the United States, where he continued his scientific career at the University of Chicago. Leo Szilard, the brilliant and restless Hungarian physicist who had collaborated with Einstein on patents for a new type of refrigerator and who possessed an almost prophetic sense of political danger, left Germany within weeks of the Nazi rise to power, recognizing with characteristic clarity that the situation would only grow worse for those of Jewish background. He made his way first to Vienna and then to England, carrying with him ideas about nuclear chain reactions that would later prove to be of tremendous significance. And then there was Einstein, whose departure was perhaps the most symbolically significant of all, for he had become the most famous scientist in the world and his name was synonymous with the achievements of German physics. Einstein had been outside Germany when the Nazis came to power, visiting the United States, and he simply never returned, renouncing his German citizenship and eventually settling at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. The Nazi press attacked him viciously, labeling his work as degenerate Jewish physics, and his books were among those burned in the public squares where crowds gathered to destroy works deemed unsuitable by the new regime. The loss of Einstein was not merely the loss of one scientist, however eminent, but rather a signal to the world that Germany was prepared to sacrifice its intellectual heritage for the sake of an ideology that valued racial purity above truth and discovery. Meitner observed these departures with a mixture of sorrow and anxiety, watching as friends and colleagues with whom she had worked for years packed their belongings and said their farewells and set off into an uncertain future. The question of whether she too should leave was one that she turned over in her mind repeatedly during these years, weighing the arguments for departure against those for remaining. There were practical considerations, for she had her laboratory and her equipment and her ongoing experiments, all of which would be difficult or impossible to replicate elsewhere, and there was the matter of her staff, the technicians and assistants who depended on her and who might be left without employment if she were to abandon her position. There was also something deeper, a reluctance to be driven from the work that had given her life meaning and from the place where she had achieved so much, a stubborn conviction that perhaps the situation would improve or that her Austrian citizenship would continue to shield her from the worst of the persecution. As the years passed, the isolation of those who remained grew more pronounced, and the practice of physics in Germany became increasingly distorted by the demands of ideology. The movement known as Deutsche Physik, or German physics, promoted by physicists such as Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark, sought to purge the discipline of what they called Jewish influences, which in practice meant rejecting the theoretical frameworks of relativity and quantum mechanics that had transformed the understanding of the physical world. This attempt to create an Aryan physics was scientifically absurd, for the laws of nature do not arrange themselves according to the ethnic background of those who discover them, but it created an atmosphere in which productive research became increasingly difficult and in which those who continued to pursue genuine scientific inquiry did so under a cloud of suspicion and disapproval. Through all of this, Meitner continued her work, and in 1934 she began a new line of research that would ultimately lead to one of the most significant discoveries in the history of physics. The catalyst for this work came from Rome, where Enrico Fermi and his group had been conducting experiments in which they bombarded various elements with neutrons, the electrically neutral particles that had been discovered by James Chadwick just 2 years earlier. Fermi's team had systematically worked their way through the periodic table, observing the radioactive substances produced when neutrons struck different atomic nuclei, and when they reached uranium, the heaviest naturally occurring element, they believed they had created new elements heavier than uranium itself, elements that did not exist in nature and that they called transuranium elements. This claim attracted great interest in the scientific community, and several research groups set out to investigate and extend Fermi's findings. Meitner was well positioned to contribute to this investigation, for the study of radioactivity had been her specialty for decades, and she had at her disposal the chemical expertise of Otto Hahn, with whom she had collaborated since her earliest days in Berlin. They were joined by a younger chemist named Fritz Strassmann, a quiet and meticulous worker who had come to the Institute in 1929 and who had demonstrated exceptional skill in the delicate chemical procedures required to separate and identify the tiny quantities of radioactive substances produced in these experiments. The three of them formed a remarkably effective team, with Meitner providing the physical insight to guide their investigations, Hahn contributing his unmatched experience in radiochemistry, and Strassmann carrying out the painstaking separations and measurements with extraordinary precision. Their work proceeded carefully over the following years, as they bombarded uranium with neutrons and attempted to identify the products of these nuclear reactions. The results were puzzling from the beginning, for the radioactive substances they detected did not behave in the ways that theory predicted, and the more carefully they examined their findings, the more confusing the picture became. They were not alone in their perplexity, for in Paris the husband and wife team of Irene Joliot-Curie and Frederick Joliot were conducting similar experiments and obtaining similarly baffling results. The Joliot-Curies, like Fermi, believed they were observing transuranium elements, but the chemical evidence was difficult to interpret and there were anomalies that resisted explanation. During these years Meitner maintained a correspondence with her nephew Otto Robert Frisch, the son of her sister Auguste, who had become a physicist himself and who had been forced to leave his position in Hamburg after the Nazi rise to power. Frisch had found refuge in Copenhagen, where he worked at the institute directed by Niels Bohr, and though the two were separated by considerable distance, their letters allowed them to discuss physics and family matters and to maintain the warm relationship that had developed between them over the years. Frisch was a gifted experimentalist with a talent for clear thinking, and his aunt valued his insights and looked forward to the occasions when they could meet in person and talk at length about their work and their lives. The year 1938 began with a sense of gathering crisis, as events in Austria moved toward a climax that would have profound consequences for Meitner personally. Adolf Hitler had long sought the annexation of Austria to Germany, a goal he called Anschluss, and in March of that year German troops crossed the border and occupied the country without significant resistance. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation and became instead a part of the German Reich, and its citizens, including Lise Meitner, were transformed overnight from foreign nationals into subjects of the Nazi state. The Austrian citizenship that had protected her for 5 years was suddenly worthless, and she found herself subject to all the racial laws that she had previously been able to avoid. The danger of her position now became acute, for as a person of Jewish heritage under Nazi law she could be dismissed from her position at any moment, and worse fates than unemployment awaited those who fell into disfavor with the regime. She continued to come to the laboratory each day, carrying on with the uranium experiments as though nothing had changed, but those around her understood that her situation had become untenable and that she would need to find a way out of Germany before it was too late. The difficulty was that leaving had become much harder than it had been in 1933, for the Nazi government now required exit visas and the surrender of property and imposed numerous other obstacles on those who wished to emigrate, and for someone in Meitner's position, stripped of citizenship and marked by her heritage, obtaining permission to leave through official channels seemed nearly impossible. The months that followed the Anschluss were a time of mounting anxiety, as Meitner continued her work while her friends and colleagues quietly explored possibilities for her escape. She was nearly 60 years old, and she had spent more than 3 decades building her career in Germany, and the prospect of starting over in a foreign country, without her laboratory, without her equipment, without the institutional support that had sustained her work for so long, must have seemed daunting indeed. Yet the alternative, remaining in a country where she was no longer welcome and where the persecution of those deemed racially undesirable grew more severe with each passing month, was becoming unthinkable. In her laboratory the uranium experiments continued, and the results grew ever more puzzling, and somewhere in those results lay a discovery that would change the world, though Meitner could not yet see it clearly, and her attention was increasingly divided between the mysteries of the atomic nucleus and the more immediate mystery of how she might save her own life. In the summer of 1938, Lise Meitner found herself caught in a narrowing corridor of possibility, as the political situation in Germany, which had been worsening steadily for several years, finally closed around her with a kind of quiet and terrible inevitability. She had remained in Berlin far longer than many of her colleagues thought wise, continuing her work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry, holding to the perhaps understandable belief that her Austrian citizenship would continue to offer some measure of protection, and that her decades of contribution to German science might still count for something in the increasingly irrational world that the National Socialists were constructing around her. But in March of that year, Germany had annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss, and with that single political event, Meitner's Austrian passport became a German one, and she became subject to all the restrictions that had been placed upon Jewish citizens of the Reich. The weeks that followed were marked by a series of increasingly desperate attempts to secure permission to leave, each one meeting with failure in one form or another, as the bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state seemed designed specifically to trap people in situations from which there could be no dignified escape. Meitner applied for permission to travel abroad, as she had done many times before for scientific conferences and collaborative visits, but these requests were now denied with a kind of administrative finality that left little room for appeal. Her colleagues in other countries began writing letters on her behalf, attempting to secure academic positions that might provide the necessary invitation for emigration, but these efforts too seemed to founder on the rocks of various practical difficulties, including the unfortunate reality that many institutions were reluctant to hire a woman of her age, regardless of her scientific accomplishments. The situation became more dire still when word reached those who were trying to help her that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, had issued an order specifically preventing German scientists from leaving the country, as the regime had become concerned about the loss of expertise that might benefit other nations. This order transformed what had been merely difficult into something approaching impossible through normal channels, and it became clear to Meitner and to her closest colleagues that if she were to leave at all, it would have to be through some other means entirely, something clandestine and not without considerable personal risk. The plan that eventually emerged was arranged primarily by Dirk Coster, a Dutch physicist who had worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen and who possessed both the necessary connections and the particular kind of calm determination that such an undertaking required. Coster traveled to Berlin in early July, meeting with Meitner and with her longtime collaborator Otto Hahn, who had been doing everything in his power to help his friend and colleague while being careful not to draw the attention of the authorities to his own position at the institute. The details of the escape were necessarily kept vague, known only to a small circle of trusted individuals, and Meitner herself was not told the precise timing until very close to the moment of departure, both for reasons of security and perhaps also to spare her the additional anxiety of too much anticipation. On the morning of July 13, 1938, Lise Meitner left her apartment in Berlin for what she must have known would be the final time, carrying with her only a small suitcase packed with summer clothing and a few personal effects, as though she were going away for a brief holiday rather than abandoning nearly everything she had built over the course of 30 years in Germany. She had been instructed to behave as normally as possible, to give no indication that anything unusual was occurring, and so she went through the motions of an ordinary departure while knowing that the stakes could not have been higher. In her purse she carried only 10 German marks, which was the maximum amount that could be taken across the border without arousing suspicion, and this small sum represented very nearly the entirety of her liquid resources for beginning a new life in an unknown country. At the train station in Berlin, Otto Hahn came to see her off, and in those final moments before her departure, he pressed into her hand a small object that she would carry with her across the border and into her uncertain future. It was a diamond ring that had belonged to his mother, given not as a sentimental keepsake but as a practical form of emergency currency, something that could be sold or pawned if circumstances became truly desperate, as they very well might for a refugee arriving in a foreign country with almost no money and no guaranteed position. The gesture was characteristic of the friendship that had developed between them over their many years of collaboration, a friendship that would be tested in various ways by the events that followed but which at that moment expressed itself in this simple and quietly generous act. The train journey northward toward the Dutch border was, by all accounts, an experience of sustained and nearly unbearable tension, as Meitner sat in her compartment watching the German countryside pass by outside the window and waiting for the moment when uniformed officials might board the train and demand to see her papers. She had been given a letter from Coster explaining that she was traveling to Holland for scientific purposes, but whether this would be sufficient to satisfy the border guards was something that could not be known in advance, and so she could only sit and wait and try to maintain an appearance of calm that she almost certainly did not feel. The border crossing itself, when it finally came, passed without incident, the guards apparently satisfied by her documents and her demeanor, and when the train pulled away from the checkpoint and into Dutch territory, Meitner found herself suddenly and somewhat surprisingly free, though the full weight of what she had lost would only become apparent to her gradually, over the weeks and months that followed. Her initial stay in Holland was brief, a matter of days spent in a kind of administrative limbo while arrangements were made for her onward travel, and during this time she began to receive letters from colleagues and friends who were relieved to learn that she had made it out safely. From Holland she traveled to Copenhagen, where she spent some time as a guest of Niels Bohr, and then eventually to Stockholm, where a position had been arranged for her at the Nobel Institute for Physics under the direction of the Swedish physicist Viennese Siegbahn. This appointment, which might have seemed from the outside like a satisfactory resolution to her difficulties, proved in practice to be something considerably less than ideal, as Siegbahn showed little interest in supporting her work and provided her with minimal resources, minimal laboratory space, and minimal collegial warmth. The months that followed her arrival in Stockholm were among the most difficult of Meitner's life, marked by a profound sense of isolation and displacement that went beyond the merely practical difficulties of establishing herself in a new country with a new language. She was 60 years old, she had left behind nearly everything familiar to her, and she found herself working in an environment where she was not particularly wanted and where her considerable expertise seemed to count for very little. The Nobel Institute was well equipped and well funded, but the equipment and funding were directed toward Siegbahn's own research interests, and Meitner was given to understand that she was expected to make do with whatever scraps of attention and resources might happen to be left over. Throughout this period of personal difficulty, however, Meitner maintained her correspondence with Otto Hahn and his assistant Fritz Strassmann, who had continued their collaborative work at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, and it was through this exchange of letters that she remained connected to the scientific research that had occupied her for so many years. Hahn and Strassmann were conducting a series of experiments involving the bombardment of uranium with neutrons, work that had grown out of earlier research inspired by the discoveries of Enrico Fermi in Rome, and they were obtaining results that puzzled them greatly, results that seemed to make no sense within the existing framework of nuclear physics. In December of 1938, Hahn wrote to Meitner describing their most recent and most confusing findings, explaining that when they bombarded uranium with slow neutrons, the chemical analysis of the products seemed to indicate the presence of barium, an element with roughly half the atomic weight of uranium. This result was deeply perplexing, because according to everything that was then understood about nuclear physics, bombarding a heavy nucleus with neutrons might cause it to emit small particles, alpha particles, or perhaps protons, but it should not be able to cause the nucleus to break apart into two roughly equal pieces. Hahn was an excellent chemist and he trusted his analytical techniques, but he could not explain what he was seeing, and so he wrote to Meitner asking for her help in understanding what might be happening. The letter reached Meitner just before Christmas, at a time when she was preparing to receive a visit from her nephew Otto Robert Frisch, who was himself a physicist working in Copenhagen at the Institute of Niels Bohr. Frisch arrived in the small Swedish town of Kungälv, where Meitner was spending the holiday at a hotel, and he found his aunt preoccupied with the letter from Hahn and the puzzle it contained. Frisch had been hoping for a restful holiday with some skiing, and initially he showed relatively little interest in discussing nuclear physics, but Meitner was insistent, and gradually he allowed himself to be drawn into consideration of the problem. On one of those winter days between Christmas and the New Year, aunt and nephew went out together into the snowy Swedish landscape, Frisch on skis and Meitner walking alongside, and as they made their way through the quiet and the cold, they began to work through the physics of what Hahn and Strassmann had observed. Meitner recalled the liquid drop model of the nucleus that had been developed by Niels Bohr and others, a model which treated the atomic nucleus as something analogous to a drop of liquid, held together by surface tension but capable of deforming and oscillating when energy was added to it. If a neutron were to enter a uranium nucleus and set it vibrating, Meitner reasoned, the vibrations might become so violent that the nucleus would stretch into an elongated shape, like a drop of water being pulled apart, and eventually the two ends might separate entirely, forming two smaller nuclei. The two of them paused in their walk, Frisch later recalled, and sat down on a fallen tree trunk to work through the calculations, using scraps of paper and the kind of mental arithmetic that came naturally to physicists of their training and experience. If the uranium nucleus were indeed splitting into two smaller nuclei, the total mass of the products would be slightly less than the mass of the original uranium, because the smaller nuclei would be more tightly bound, and this missing mass would have to appear as energy, in accordance with the famous equation that Einstein had published more than 3 decades earlier, the equation expressing the equivalence of mass and energy. When they worked out the numbers, they found that the energy released by a single such event would be approximately 200 million electron volts, an enormous amount of energy by the standards of nuclear processes, and more than enough to explain the energetic phenomena that had been observed in such experiments. By the time they returned from their walk, Meitner and Frisch had arrived at a theoretical understanding of what was happening when uranium was bombarded with neutrons, an understanding that would soon transform not only nuclear physics but the entire course of human history. Frisch returned to Copenhagen shortly after the New Year and discussed the idea with Niels Bohr, who immediately grasped its significance and reportedly struck himself on the forehead, exclaiming that they had all been fools not to see it sooner. Bo was about to depart for the United States, and he carried the news with him, spreading it through the American physics community within days of his arrival. Meanwhile, Meitner and Frisch prepared a short paper for the journal Nature, setting out their theoretical explanation of the phenomenon, and it was Frisch who suggested the term by which it would come to be known. He had consulted with a biologist colleague about what word was used to describe the division of a living cell into two daughter cells, and the biologist had told him that the process was called fission, and so Frisch proposed that they use this same word to describe the splitting of the atomic nucleus, and the term nuclear fission entered the vocabulary of science and eventually of the entire world. The paper appeared in Nature in January of 1939, only weeks after that quiet walk in the Swedish snow, and within months laboratories around the world were replicating and extending the work, exploring the implications of this new phenomenon and gradually coming to understand both its promise and its peril. For Meitner herself, the discovery represented a kind of bittersweet triumph, a profound intellectual achievement accomplished under conditions of exile and hardship, and she would spend much of the rest of her long life reflecting on what it meant and what responsibilities it placed upon those who had helped to bring it into being. And so we come now to the war years, which were also the Sweden years, and which stretched on for Lise Meitner far longer than anyone might have expected when she first arrived in that northern country in the summer of 1938. She was nearly 60 years old when she crossed the border from Denmark into Sweden, carrying very little with her, and she would remain there for almost a decade, through all the years of the war and several years beyond, in circumstances that were often difficult in ways both large and small, and that tested her resilience in a manner quite different from the challenges she had faced in Berlin. The institute where she found herself was the Nobel Institute for Physics in Stockholm, directed by Mene Siegbahn, who had himself won the Nobel Prize in Physics some years earlier for his work on X-ray spectroscopy. One might have imagined that such a placement would have been ideal for a physicist of Meitner's stature and experience, but in practice the arrangement proved to be deeply unsatisfying and at times rather humiliating. Siegbahn was not, it must be said gently, a supportive host. He had his own research program and his own priorities, and he does not appear to have made much effort to integrate Meitner into the working life of his institute or to provide her with the resources she needed to continue her experimental work. The laboratory space allocated to her was inadequate, and the equipment she was given access to was similarly insufficient for the kind of precise measurements that her research required. She found herself, after decades of leading her own section at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, after years of having technicians and assistants and the finest instruments available, relegated to a kind of professional limbo. She had a position, yes, and a title of sorts, but she did not have the practical means to do the work she knew how to do, and this was a source of considerable frustration and sadness for her during those years. Her salary was modest, quite modest really, especially when one considers her age and her accomplishments and the fact that she had essentially lost everything when she fled Germany. She lived alone in a small apartment in Stockholm, what one might call a bachelor flat, furnished simply and without much in the way of comfort or luxury. The winters in Stockholm were long and dark, darker than anything she had known in Vienna or Berlin, and she felt the cold keenly, both the physical cold of the Swedish climate and the emotional cold of her isolation from the scientific community that had been her home for so many years. She was lonely, there is no other way to describe it, and her letters from this period reflect a woman who was struggling to find her footing in a place where she had few friends and fewer colleagues who understood or appreciated the significance of her work. The Swedish scientific establishment was not particularly welcoming to outsiders, and Meitner, despite her international reputation, was very much an outsider in Stockholm. She did not speak Swedish when she arrived, and though she learned it in time, the language barrier added another layer of difficulty to her daily life and her professional interactions. And yet, even in these reduced circumstances, she continued to think and to work and to correspond with physicists around the world, maintaining her intellectual engagement with the rapidly evolving field of nuclear physics even when she could not contribute to it experimentally in the way she would have wished. She taught a small number of graduate students during these years, passing on what she knew to a new generation, and she found some satisfaction in this teaching, though it was a far cry from the active research program she had once directed. There were bright spots in those dark years, friendships that sustained her and gave her some measure of comfort. One such friendship was with Eva von Barbergius, a Swedish physicist who had herself faced obstacles as a woman in science and who understood something of what Meitner was experiencing. The two women became close, and Eva provided both practical support and emotional companionship during a time when Meitner badly needed both. This friendship was a genuine source of warmth in an otherwise rather chilly existence, and Meitner valued it deeply. Another unexpected source of support came from the King of Sweden himself, Gustav V, who took a personal interest in Meitner and treated her with a respect and consideration that she did not always receive from the Swedish scientific community. The king invited her to the palace on several occasions, and these royal attentions, while perhaps surprising, were a recognition of her standing as one of the leading scientists of her generation, even if that recognition was not always forthcoming from her immediate colleagues at the institute. The war years brought with them a particular kind of anxiety for Meitner, who had family members still in occupied Europe and who worried constantly about their safety. Her sisters, her nephews and nieces, friends and former colleagues, all were caught up in the terrible machinery of the Nazi regime, and news from the continent was often slow to arrive and frequently distressing when it did. She wrote letters when she could, trying to maintain contact, trying to offer what help was possible from her position in neutral Sweden, but there was only so much she could do, and the helplessness she felt was a constant weight upon her during those years. Her nephew Otto Robert Frisch, who had been with her in Kungälv when they first understood what Hahn and Strassmann had discovered, had gone to England and was deeply involved in war-related research there. Meitner knew, or suspected, or eventually learned, that this research was connected to the possibility of building a weapon based on the fission process that she had helped to explain. And in 1943, when the Allied powers began in earnest to develop what would become the atomic bomb, there were those who thought that Meitner should be invited to participate in this work. She was approached, it is documented, about the possibility of contributing to what came to be known as the Manhattan Project, the vast American-led effort to build a nuclear weapon before the Germans could do so. But Meitner refused. She refused clearly and without equivocation, stating that she would have nothing to do with a bomb. This was not a decision made lightly or without understanding of what was at stake, for Meitner understood better than most people alive at that time exactly what the fission of uranium could mean, exactly how much energy could be released, exactly what destruction might be wrought. But she had spent her life in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, in the belief that understanding the natural world was a noble and worthy endeavor, and she could not bring herself to turn that knowledge toward the creation of a weapon designed to kill on a massive scale. This refusal set her apart from many of her former colleagues, including her beloved nephew Frisch, who did participate in the Allied nuclear program and who was present at the Trinity test in 1945 when the first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert. Meitner's choice was a moral one, rooted in her own sense of what she could and could not be a party to, and she never wavered from it, even as the war ground on and the stakes grew ever higher. And then, in November of 1944, came news that must have been both expected and devastating in its particulars. The Nobel Prize in Chemistry for that year was awarded to Otto Hahn, and to Otto Hahn alone, for the discovery of nuclear fission. The prize committee's decision made no mention of Meitner's contributions, no acknowledgement of the theoretical framework she had provided, no recognition of the years of collaborative work that had made the discovery possible. Hahn received the prize, and Meitner did not, and the citation spoke as though fission had been a purely chemical discovery made by a chemist working alone. It is difficult to convey how painful this must have been for her. She and Hahn had worked together for 30 years. She had been his partner in the research that led to the discovery of fission. She had been the one who first understood what Hahn's chemical results actually meant in physical terms, who had worked out the energy calculations with Frisch, who had provided the theoretical explanation that transformed puzzling laboratory results into a new understanding of the atomic nucleus. And now, because she had been forced to flee Germany, because she was a woman in a field dominated by men, because the Nobel Committee was perhaps influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with scientific merit, she found herself excluded from the recognition that by any reasonable standard should have been hers as well as his. Her reaction, as recorded in her letters and recollected by those who knew her, was one of deep hurt, though she expressed it with characteristic restraint and dignity. She did not publicly attack the decision or demand that it be reconsidered. She did not sever her friendship with Hahn, though their relationship was undoubtedly strained by this outcome and by other factors connected to the war and its aftermath. She simply noted, quietly and sadly, that she had been overlooked, and she carried on with her work and her life as best she could. The response from the scientific community was mixed. There were those who felt that the Nobel Committee had made a reasonable decision, that Hahn's chemical identification of the fission products was indeed the crucial experimental achievement, that Meitner's theoretical contributions, while important, were of a different order. But there were also many, particularly among physicists who understood the full history of the discovery, who felt that a grave injustice had been done, that Meitner's exclusion from the prize was a stain on the Nobel institution and a reflection of biases that had no place in the recognition of scientific achievement. In the years that followed, various scientists nominated Meitner repeatedly for the Nobel Prize in Physics, hoping that she might be recognized through that avenue if not through chemistry. These nominations came from distinguished figures in the field, from people who knew her work and understood its significance, and they came year after year, a persistent effort to correct what many saw as a profound wrong. But the physics prize never came, and Meitner lived out the rest of her life without that particular recognition, though she received many other honors and awards in the years after the war. The war ended in 1945, and the world learned what had been done with the knowledge of fission, what terrible destruction had been unleashed upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Meitner, who had refused to participate in the bomb's creation, now found herself associated with it in the public mind simply because her name was connected to the discovery of the process that made it possible. She was sometimes called the mother of the atomic bomb, a description she found deeply distressing and profoundly unfair, and she spent considerable effort in her later years trying to correct this mischaracterization, to explain that she had had no part in the weapons development and had in fact explicitly refused to be involved. She remained in Sweden through the immediate post-war years, still working at the institute under Siegbahn, still living in her modest apartment, still corresponding with physicists around the world and still contributing what she could to the advancement of knowledge. In 1947, she finally left the Nobel Institute and took a position at the Royal Institute of Technology, also in Stockholm, where the conditions for her work were somewhat improved, and in 1949, she became a Swedish citizen, formally adopting the country that had given her refuge when she had nowhere else to go. It had been a difficult decade, those war years in Sweden, marked by professional frustration and personal loneliness and the particular anguish of watching from a distance as the world convulsed in violence and as her life's work was turned to purposes she could not condone. But she had endured, as she had endured so much else in her long life, with patience and dignity and an unwavering commitment to the values that had guided her from the beginning. In the years that followed the war, Lise Meitner found herself occupying a curious position in the world of physics, a position that was at once celebrated and tinged with a particular kind of sorrow that she carried quietly within her. The woman who had helped unlock the secret of the splitting atom now entered what we might call her honored years, though honor, as she would come to understand, could be a complicated thing, arriving sometimes too late, sometimes in forms that felt incomplete, and sometimes alongside people whose wartime choices had created distances that even decades of friendship could not entirely bridge. The year 1946 brought Meitner to America for the first time, and this journey across the Atlantic carried her to lecture halls and universities where her name was spoken with genuine reverence. She had been invited to serve as a visiting professor, and the institutions that welcomed her did so with the kind of respect that acknowledged both her scientific contributions and the extraordinary circumstances of her life. When she stood before the physics colloquium at Harvard University, she became the first woman ever to lecture in that particular setting, though she would have noted, in her characteristically modest way, that she was there simply to discuss physics and that the matter of being first was incidental to the work itself. The American scientists who gathered to hear her speak found a woman of 6 to 7 years, small in stature but possessed of a clarity of thought and a gentleness of manner that made even the most complex ideas feel accessible, as if she was simply explaining something quite natural and lovely to a friend over tea. Her time in America introduced her to a scientific community that had been transformed by the war in ways both visible and invisible. The Manhattan Project had changed everything, of course, and the physicists she met carried within them the weight of what their collective knowledge had created. Meitner understood this weight perhaps better than most, for she had spent the war years in Stockholm watching from a distance as the discovery she had helped interpret was turned toward purposes she found deeply troubling. When journalists asked her about her feelings regarding nuclear weapons, she spoke carefully and with evident pain about the responsibility that scientists must bear, about the difference between understanding nature and deciding how that understanding should be used, and about her own firm conviction that atomic energy should serve peaceful purposes, should light homes and power hospitals, should never again be turned toward the destruction of cities and the ending of human lives. The question of responsibility hung heavily over her correspondence during these years, particularly in her communications with Otto Hahn and the other German scientists who had remained in their homeland throughout the Nazi period. Hahn had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1944, announced in 1945, for the discovery of nuclear fission, and while Meitner had reason to feel overlooked by this decision, since her theoretical interpretation had been essential to understanding what Hahn's chemical experiments had revealed, her deeper concerns lay elsewhere. What troubled her more profoundly was the apparent unwillingness of her former colleagues to fully reckon with what had happened in Germany, with the complicity of scientists who had not spoken out, with the silence that had allowed terrible things to proceed unchallenged. In the summer of 1945, she wrote to Hahn a letter that expressed, with the precision of a scientist and the disappointment of a friend, her feelings about the German scientific community's behavior during the war years. She did not shout or condemn, for that was not her way, but she laid out clearly her belief that by remaining and continuing their work without protest, the German scientists had provided a kind of legitimacy to a regime that should have been opposed at every opportunity. She wrote that they had allowed themselves to be used, that their presence had helped normalize what should never have been normalized, and that their claims of having been merely apolitical researchers rang hollow when set against the enormity of what the Nazi government had done. It was a difficult letter to write and surely a difficult letter to receive, and though her friendship with Hahn would continue in a diminished form for many years afterward, something had changed between them that could not be unchanged, a rupture in trust that no amount of shared scientific history could fully repair. Hahn, for his part, struggled to understand her perspective, and his responses reflected the complicated self-justifications that many German scientists offered during the post-war period. He spoke of having done what he could, of small acts of kindness toward Jewish colleagues, of the impossibility of open resistance. Meitner listened to these explanations and found them inadequate, not because she lacked compassion for the difficult position her friends had faced, but because she believed that some situations demanded courage even when courage was costly, and that the failure to find that courage should be acknowledged rather than explained away. This disagreement between them, never fully resolved, cast a shadow over what should have been triumphant years of recognition and honor. Despite these complications, the honors did come, and they came with increasing frequency as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s. In 1949, Meitner received the Max Planck Medal from the German Physical Society, an award that recognized her extraordinary contributions to theoretical physics and that placed her name alongside the greatest figures in the field. The medal was awarded jointly to her and to Otto Hahn, a pairing that carried within it all the tensions of their post-war relationship, the shared history and the unshared burden of moral reckoning. She accepted the honor graciously, as she accepted all honors, with a quiet acknowledgement that the work had always mattered more to her than the recognition, though recognition, when it came, was not unwelcome. Her election to the Swedish Academy of Sciences represented another kind of vindication, an acknowledgement from the country that had given her refuge that she belonged among the most distinguished scientists of her generation. Sweden had become her home during the war years, though it had never quite felt like home in the way that Berlin once had, and this formal recognition helped to anchor her more firmly in her adopted country. She continued her research at the Nobel Institute for Physics, working on the properties of nuclear shells and contributing her theoretical insights to a field that was expanding rapidly in the post-war years, and she found satisfaction in the quiet rhythms of scientific inquiry even as the larger world continued to grapple with the implications of what that inquiry had produced. The 1950s brought more awards, more honorary degrees, more invitations to speak and to be celebrated. She received honorary doctorates from universities across Europe and America, each ceremony requiring her to don academic robes and accept the applause of assembled scholars who recognized in her both scientific excellence and a kind of moral courage that had become increasingly valued in the years after the war. She was named a foreign member of the Royal Society in London, joining a small number of women who had been so honored, and she received the Otto Hahn Prize for Chemistry and Physics in 1955, an award whose name must have carried complex resonances for her even as she accepted it with characteristic grace. Throughout these years, Meitner maintained an active correspondence with scientists and friends around the world, her letters filled with scientific discussions, personal reflections, and the kind of thoughtful commentary on current events that revealed a mind still fully engaged with the world around her. She wrote about the arms race with evident concern, about the testing of hydrogen bombs with something approaching despair, and about the possibility that humanity might yet find better uses for the energy locked within the atom. Her advocacy for peaceful applications of nuclear power was consistent and heartfelt, rooted in her belief that science itself was neutral but that scientists had obligations to guide their discoveries toward beneficial ends. By 1960, Meitner had reached her 81st year, and the daily demands of active research had become more than her body could comfortably sustain. She made the decision to leave Sweden and move to Cambridge, England, where her beloved nephew Otto Robert Frisch had established himself as a professor of physics. Frisch had been her collaborator on the paper that explained nuclear fission, had worked alongside her during those crucial days in the Swedish snow when the full meaning of Hahn's results had become clear, and he represented the closest thing to family that remained to her after so many losses. The move to Cambridge was a retirement of sorts, though Meitner did not retire in any complete sense, continuing to lecture when invited, to correspond with colleagues, and to follow the developments in physics that still captured her imagination. Her flat in Cambridge became a gathering place for physicists who wished to pay their respects, to hear her stories of the early days of radioactivity research, and to seek her perspective on the questions that currently occupied the field. She received visitors with warmth and with tea, speaking in her accented English about Planck and Boltzmann and the seminars of old Vienna, about the excitement of discovering new elements and the profound shift in understanding that quantum mechanics had brought. Her memory remained sharp, her interest in scientific problems undiminished, and her opinions on matters of science policy as firmly held as ever. In 1966, when she was 87 years old, Meitner received what would be her final major honor, the Enrico Fermi Award from the United States Atomic Energy Commission. The award recognized her pioneering work on nuclear fission and was presented jointly to her, to Otto Hahn, and to Fritz Strassmann, the three scientists whose combined efforts had led to the discovery that changed the world. Meitner was the first woman to receive this prestigious recognition, a distinction that she accepted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire career. By this time, she was too frail to travel to America to receive the award in person, and so it was brought to her in Cambridge, where representatives of the American government presented it to her in a small ceremony that honored both her scientific achievements and the extraordinary life she had lived. Her final years included at least one appearance on television, where she spoke about her life and work to an audience that extended far beyond the scientific community. The medium was new to her, this business of cameras and broadcast signals carrying her image into homes across the country, but she approached it with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized all her public communications. She spoke of her early education, of the barriers she had faced as a woman in physics, of her collaboration with Hahn and the discovery of fission, and of her hopes for a future in which atomic energy would serve humanity rather than threaten it. Her voice was gentle, her manner unassuming, and viewers who knew nothing of nuclear physics came away with an impression of a remarkable woman who had lived through remarkable times. Lise Meitner spent her final years in Cambridge, surrounded by books and correspondence, visited by Frisch and by the many scientists who counted themselves fortunate to have known her. She read widely, followed the news with keen interest, and maintained the intellectual curiosity that had defined her since childhood. The honors she had received, numerous though they were, meant less to her than the work itself had meant, less than the thrill of understanding something new about nature, less than the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved or a theory confirmed. She had lived long enough to see physics transformed utterly from the field she had entered as a young woman, long enough to witness both the terrible and the hopeful applications of atomic energy, and long enough to know that her own contributions would be remembered even after she was gone. These were peaceful years, unhurried years, years in which an honored elder of physics could rest at last from her labors and reflect, with whatever mixture of pride and sorrow such reflections might bring, on a life devoted to the pursuit of truth. In the year 1960, when Lise Meitner was 81 years old, she made her final move, leaving Sweden after more than 2 decades and traveling to England, where she would spend the remaining years of her life in the quiet company of her nephew Otto Robert Frisch and his family, settling into the gentle rhythms of Cambridge and its surrounding countryside, a place of old stone colleges and slow-moving rivers and the kind of unhurried academic atmosphere that had always suited her temperament, though she was now very far from the laboratories and lecture halls where she had spent so much of her working life, and the move itself represented a kind of coming to rest, a recognition that the time for active research had passed and that what remained was the simpler business of living out one's days among people who loved her and understood something of what her life had meant. The house in Cambridge where she first stayed with the Frisch family was a comfortable place, filled with books and conversation and the occasional visit from colleagues who remembered her work and wanted to pay their respects, and Meitner found herself settling into a routine of reading and correspondence and quiet contemplation, her mind still sharp even as her body began to show the inevitable signs of age, the slowing of movement, the need for longer rests between activities, the gradual acceptance that certain things were no longer possible, though she bore these limitations with the same steady patience that had characterized her approach to experimental difficulties throughout her career, never complaining, never dramatizing her circumstances, simply adjusting to what was and finding what satisfaction she could in the life that remained available to her. Her correspondence during these years continued with remarkable consistency, letters traveling back and forth between Cambridge and various corners of the scientific world, connecting her to former students and colleagues and friends who had scattered across continents and decades, and she took evident pleasure in maintaining these connections, in hearing about new discoveries and following the progress of younger researchers whose careers she had helped to shape, though she wrote more slowly. Now, her handwriting less certain than it had once been, and the letters themselves often dwelt on memories rather than current events, the past becoming more vivid to her than the present in the way that often happens to those who have lived long and eventful lives. Visitors came to see her with some regularity during these Cambridge years, former students who had gone on to distinguished careers of their own, colleagues from the Berlin days who were still living, younger scientists who had read her papers and wanted to meet the woman behind the work, and Meitner received them all with the same quiet courtesy, her conversations still precise and thoughtful even when her energy flagged, and she would sit with them in comfortable chairs and talk about physics and politics and the strange turns that history had taken during her lifetime, never seeking sympathy for what she had endured, never emphasizing the difficulties or the disappointments, but simply recounting the facts as she remembered them with the careful accuracy of someone who had spent her life trying to understand the truth of things. As the 1960s progressed, her health began to decline more noticeably, and she moved from the Frisch family home to a small nursing home in the village of Bramley in Hampshire, a quiet place among green fields and ancient hedgerows, where she could receive the care she needed while remaining within reach of those who loved her, and she adapted to this new arrangement with characteristic acceptance, making no fuss about the loss of independence, finding what contentment she could in the small pleasures that remained available to her, the view from her window, the visits from Otto and his family, the letters that still arrived from around the world addressed to Professor Meitner or sometimes simply to the famous physicist at the nursing home in Bramley. During these final years, she experienced a series of small strokes, each one taking something from her physical capabilities, limiting her mobility, making it harder for her to walk or to write or to perform the simple tasks of daily living that had once been automatic, yet remarkably, her mind remained clear and active, her memory intact, her ability to think and reason and engage with ideas undiminished by the difficulties affecting her body, and those who visited her during this period often remarked on the contrast between her physical frailty and her mental acuity, the way she could still discuss complex scientific concepts or recall precise details from experiments conducted half a century earlier even as she needed assistance with the most basic activities of daily life. The correspondence continued even when she could no longer write the letters herself, dictated to nurses or family members who would take down her words and send them on to their intended recipients, and in this way she maintained her connections to the wider world, to the scientific community that had been her home for so many decades, to the friends and colleagues who still thought of her and wanted to know how she was getting on, and there was something touching about these final letters. The voice of this remarkable woman coming through even when the handwriting was no longer her own, the same precision and courtesy and intellectual engagement that had characterized her correspondence throughout her life. Otto Hahn, her collaborator and friend and complicated companion through so many years of scientific work, died on July 28, 1968, just a few months before Meitner herself would follow him, and the news of his death reached her at the nursing home in Bramley, where she received it with the quiet grief of someone who had lost a connection stretching back more than half a century, to those early days in Berlin when they had been young researchers working together in a converted carpentry shop, before the wars and the exile and the Nobel Prize and all the complications that had come between them, and whatever disappointments or frustrations she may have felt about the way history had treated their partnership, she mourned him genuinely, recognizing that something irreplaceable had gone from the world with his passing. The autumn of 1968 came to Hampshire with its usual English mildness, the leaves turning slowly on the trees surrounding the nursing home, the days growing shorter, the light taking on that particular golden quality that belongs to October in the English countryside, and Lise Meitner moved through these final weeks in a state of peaceful resignation, her body growing weaker, her need for sleep increasing, her awareness of the outside world becoming more intermittent, though she remained herself to the end, courteous and precise and quietly determined to face whatever came with the same dignity that had characterized her approach to every challenge in her long life. On October 27, 1968, just a few days before what would have been her 90th birthday, Lise Meitner died peacefully in her sleep at the nursing home in Bramley, her passing as quiet and undramatic as she would have wished it to be, no struggle, no distress, simply a gentle cessation. The remarkable mind that had contributed so much to our understanding of the physical world finally coming to rest after nearly 9 decades of continuous thought and inquiry, and those who found her in the morning reported that she looked peaceful, as though she had simply decided that the time had come and had let go without resistance or regret. Her funeral was held at St. James' Church in Bramley, a small English country church of the kind that has stood in villages like this for centuries, ancient stone walls and a quiet churchyard and the particular atmosphere of timeless serenity that such places possess, and the service was attended by family members and close friends and a small gathering of those who had known her and wanted to pay their final respects, nothing grand or ceremonial, nothing that would have embarrassed this modest woman who had always been uncomfortable with public attention, just a simple farewell in a peaceful English village far from Vienna and Berlin and Stockholm and all the other places where her life had unfolded. The epitaph that her nephew Otto Robert Frisch composed for her gravestone captured something essential about who she had been, stating simply that she was a physicist who never lost her humanity, and these words, carved into stone in that quiet English churchyard, stand as a fitting summary of a life that had encompassed so much, the scientific achievements and the personal struggles, the exile and the survival, the disappointments and the quiet satisfactions, all of it contained in that simple recognition that she had managed to remain fully human through everything that had happened to her, never becoming bitter, never losing her capacity for kindness and wonder and genuine engagement with the world around her. The posthumous honors that eventually came to Lise Meitner would have surprised and perhaps slightly embarrassed her, accustomed as she was to working in relative obscurity and receiving less recognition than her contributions deserved, yet history has a way of correcting itself over time, and in the decades following her death, her name began to appear in places that ensured she would not be forgotten by future generations of scientists and students. In 1997, nearly 30 years after her death, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry officially named element 109 in her honor, calling it Meitnerium, a fitting tribute to someone who had contributed so much to our understanding of atomic structure and nuclear processes, and this element, though too unstable to exist for more than fractions of a second before decaying into other substances, carries her name into the periodic table itself, that fundamental document of chemistry and physics that hangs on classroom walls around the world, ensuring that students for generations to come will encounter her name and perhaps be moved to learn more about the woman behind it. Craters on both the Moon and Venus now bear her name as well, geological features on distant worlds named in recognition of her scientific achievements, and there is something poignant about this. The name of this woman who spent so much of her life bent over laboratory equipment and scientific papers now inscribed on the surfaces of celestial bodies she never saw except as points of light in the night sky, her legacy extending quite literally beyond the boundaries of the Earth she studied so carefully. The scholarly debate about her exclusion from the Nobel Prize has continued in the decades since her death, with historians of science and physicists and journalists all contributing to a growing consensus that an injustice was done, that her contributions to the discovery of nuclear fission were essential and that the decision to award the prize to Hahn alone reflected the biases and limitations of the selection committee rather than the actual history of the discovery, and this ongoing discussion has served to keep her story alive in ways that a straightforward Nobel Prize might not have done, turning her into a symbol of the obstacles faced by women in science and the ways in which recognition has often been distributed unfairly along lines of gender and nationality and institutional affiliation. In 1992, the chairman of the Nobel Committee for Physics made a remarkable public acknowledgement, stating explicitly that the exclusion of Lise Meitner from the Nobel Prize for the discovery of nuclear fission had been an injustice, a formal recognition from the institution itself that something had gone wrong in the evaluation of her work, and while this acknowledgement could not undo the disappointment she had felt during her lifetime or restore to her the honor she had deserved, it represented an important moment in the historical record, an official admission that the scientific establishment had failed to recognize one of its most significant contributors. Her life has been documented in biographies and academic studies and popular accounts, each new generation of writers finding in her story something worth telling and retelling: the remarkable journey from Vienna to Berlin to Sweden to England, the scientific achievements and the personal struggles, the quiet persistence and the refusal to compromise her principles, all of it providing material for books that continue to appear in bookstores and libraries around the world, keeping her memory alive for readers who never knew her but who recognize in her story something universal about the pursuit of knowledge and the challenges of living an ethical life in difficult times. Documentaries have been made about her life, presenting her story through archival photographs and interviews with those who knew her and dramatic recreations of key moments in her career, bringing her image and her voice to audiences who might never read a scientific paper or visit the sites where she worked, and these films have introduced her to new generations of viewers, students and general audiences and curious observers who find themselves moved by the combination of scientific achievement and personal courage that her life represented. Plays and theatrical productions have dramatized episodes from her life, bringing her story to the stage, where actors speak her words and embody her experiences for live audiences, and these performances have added another dimension to her legacy, transforming the facts of her biography into art, into shared emotional experiences that audiences can witness together in the intimate space of a theater, connecting with her story in ways that reading alone might not allow. Her scientific legacy remains substantial and enduring, encompassing more than 150 published papers on topics ranging from radioactivity to nuclear physics to the fundamental nature of matter and energy, a body of work that contributed significantly to our understanding of the physical world and that continues to be cited and studied by researchers working in related fields, her name appearing in footnotes and bibliographies and the acknowledgement sections of scientific papers. A quiet but persistent presence in the ongoing conversation that constitutes scientific progress. Her pioneering work in nuclear physics helped to establish the field itself, contributing to the theoretical and experimental foundations upon which later researchers would build, and the techniques she developed, the questions she asked, the careful methodology she practiced all became part of the standard approach to nuclear research, absorbed into the discipline so thoroughly that later scientists might not even realize they were following paths she had helped to clear. Perhaps most significantly, she has become a model for women in science, her life demonstrating both the obstacles that women have faced in pursuing scientific careers and the possibility of overcoming those obstacles through persistence and excellence and an unwavering commitment to the work itself, and young women entering physics and chemistry and related fields today can look to her example and find encouragement, seeing in her story proof that it is possible to contribute meaningfully to human knowledge even when the institutions and attitudes of the time are stacked against you. And so her legacy continues, not just in the element that bears her name or the craters on distant worlds or the honors bestowed posthumously, but in the ongoing work of scientists around the world who follow in her footsteps, asking questions about the nature of matter and energy, working patiently in laboratories, publishing their findings, adding to the collective understanding that she helped to build, her life becoming part of the larger story of human inquiry that stretches back through the centuries and forward into whatever future awaits us, a story in which she occupies an honored place, remembered not just for what she discovered but for who she was, a physicist who never lost her humanity.